Yeah, we're live. Hi, guys. Hey, Diane. Good to see you.
Hi, my name is Gary Wayne, and I've written a book called The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, How Secret Societies and the Descendants
Hi,
of
Baz. Good to
Giants
see you,
Plan
mate.
to Enslave Humankind. It's a book that I spent 30 years in research and in writing the book. It was one of those books that I thought I wanted to write. I wanted to discuss and connect how this very, very strange verse and chapter in Genesis 6, connects to so much else of the Bible and what has taken place in history. And what caught my attention was this very odd few lines in the opening to actually what is the flood narrative. And so how did that connect to the flood narrative? And that's where the sons of God went to the daughters of men, and they produced Nephilim. And in some translations, like the King James Version, actually says giants instead of Nephilim.
Okay, it's glaring
It also
already.
says that these Nephilim were before and after the flood. And so how did that happen if everyone was destroyed except for Noah and his family on the flood? And then all these giants pop up after the flood, names like Abites and Emites and Samson, fallen angels and demons being very much involved as a major sign for the end times. And
Back
also
at you,
the
boss.
interesting connection.
Back at you, mate.
In the Luke's version of that prophecy, what is their connection to Sodom? So I wanted to create a narrative that made some sense in my mind, and try and come up with a rational explanation that makes sense biblically. I decided I wanted to bring in a connection that I thought might be obvious, that there were giants recorded in every other culture around the world, on every continent. And was that just a coincidence, or was it telling the same kind of story? And as I was doing that research, I came across documents and books and information about a society that everybody is familiar with called Freemasonry, that actually takes their prehistory legends all the way back to the same time frame as Genesis 6 and before, with another parallel account, albeit from a different belief system and a different perspective. And all of a sudden that brought the secret societies into this whole narrative that starts in prehistory, also crosses the flood. And so I wanted to connect that. So the book at some point in time went from a narrative just about Nephilim to a book about the creation and the rise of the Nephilim and their kingships, alongside the mystical religions and the secret societies that rose up around them, partnered with them, somehow crossed the flood, and continue to this day.
Okay.
The sons of God going to the daughters of men, creating the Nephilim, which became the heroes
stood on the laptop.
Renown. And so when we look at some original translations there, we look at the sons of God, and who were they? The Nephilim, who exactly were they? And then the heroes of old and the men of renown, which is the hero, is the Hebrew word Gibron. And so then we have, in how people will interpret this verse, who actually are these people? And so that's the contentious issues that you're referring to, and is argued from all different aspects. So just let me slowly walk through who these three groups or three names of groups actually were, and why it is exactly as it is written in Genesis 6. And so the sons of God, many people believe that they were just the sons of Seth, and therefore these weren't actually giants. They were just another branch of people that came up that were evil. Well, that's a very good interpretation, because if you go into the New Testament and we talk about the sons of God, those are just human beings. Or if we talk about the children of Israel, those were just average human Israelites. So what makes the sons of God in Genesis 6 actually fallen angels? Well, the original translation is the Bene Ha-Elohim, and that stands for the sons of God. And if we want to go for an exact Old Testament interpretation, we need to go to Job, the book of Job, and in
I never knew that.
particular verses in Job, it translates angels with an asterisk and an annotation at the bottom of the page that in ancient Hebrew, angels were the sons of God. And so if we look at the two other possible translations, the children of Israel in the Old Testament and the sons of God in the New Testament, we find that those two translations, the first one is the children of Israel, that is actually a prophecy for the end time and beyond. So that's not referring to the same sons of God that are in Genesis 6. And in the New Testament, it's a doctrine of adoption into being a sons of God. So it comes at the Pentecost, and it has no direct relationship to what's being referred to in the Old Testament, in particular Genesis 6. So I'm on pretty sound ground. I think that, although I understand the argument that people think that they're regular men, if they were just regular men marrying the daughters of regular men, they wouldn't produce giants. I mean, something would have to be going on that is completely different, and you would have to actually add to the narrative to make some sort of sense of it. And so now we move into the word Nephilim, which actually translates as the fallen ones. And so some people say that those were the angels and not, and that the giants were actually the Gibborim, and I'll get to Gibborim next, which are the men of renown. Well, if we look at mythologies from around the world, and people have probably heard people like out of the mythologies, like in Greek, where we have the Titans, or we have the Anunnaki in Sumerian mythology. The Titans were two different groups. One was giants, and one were the gods. And so if we look at the Anunnaki in Sumerian mythology, we have the same thing. So we have two groups. One was giants and one was gods. And so the second group, which is the offspring of the gods and human females in polytheist and philosophy and mythology, they produced earthborn gods. And we need to understand that the Nephilim were like a demigod. And they were a demigod in both the Genesis account and on all other accounts around the world. So they were part God or part fallen angel in the monotheist belief system, our belief system. And they were also part God and part human in all the other belief systems. So we have something that's rather unique, and it's a very consistent narrative around the world.
I know, right?
So again, humans copulating with other humans can produce demigods. And so when people want to confuse Nephilim, even though it's a specific separate word with the sons of God, which is one of the other arguments, they're confusing the two, even though you can have the same name. We know from translations that the sons of God were always the Bene Ha-Elohim. They were not called Nephilim in the monotheist belief system. Now, many people say that the Nephilim weren't giants and supergiants, they were just Gibborim, men of renown and heroes of old. The Gibborim weren't necessarily Nephilim, but they were kings, and they were potentates, and they were evil potentates. And so when Gibborim is used later in the Old Testament, we see it come up in Ezekiel when it's talking about very powerful kings, and we also see it come up when it's talking about Nimrod. And I do understand many people think that Nimrod was a giant, but I'll argue he was actually Gibram, and that was the specific application for Nimrod as a hero of old. And so people's argument will be is yes, they were powerful kings, but they weren't giants. What people need to understand is the Bible is very specific in the application of the words, and it's always 100% accurate, and it is never in contradiction. So Nephilim were both giants and kings and evil potentates. So you could be a Gibram and be human and be an evil potentate, but that doesn't necessarily make you Nephilim. But the Nephilim were both. And in the old world, and immediately after the flood, the Nephilim they usurped all of the kingships, and they controlled all the royal dynasties, and they ruled over humankind. So we have those three entities. We have the sons of God, we have the Gibram, and we have the Nephilim. Now, if we go over to Greek mythology, people will understand if we talk about Hercules or Theseus or any of the famous titans. They might be surprised to know that when we go into the ancient annals recording these mythologies, they were also known as the men of renown and heroes of old. And again, these were giants, and they were demigods, and they were the sons of gods. And so I think when we have a coincidence such as this that crosses over to other religions and other mythologies, and there's more of these testimonies around the world, that we need to take probably into account that when there are parallel accounts, they're telling a similar story, perhaps from a different perspective, but understand that they're telling the same story. And so when we look at these giants being the kings, we have to start looking at their dynasties and the bloodlines that descended from them that exist to this day. And also in Genesis 6, we look at the controversial statement that Nephilim were both before and after the flood. So we have to then to take into account, did angels go and copulate a second time after the flood to create giants, or did giants somehow survive the flood? And I'll take that on in the book and provide both explanations as possible. And I think people will be very, very surprised at the amount of evidence to support both. Now, the daughters of men would be the other component of Genesis 6. And most people assume that that's just going to be the descendants of Cain. And I bring this up, and I'll prove in the book that likely they were the descendants of Cain, and that they were predisposed to create this sin. That it was the daughters of Cain that mated with the sons of angels in the 6th generation, the generation of Jared, to produce the giants. And what's important about this is to understand Genesis 6. We need to understand what happened immediately after and immediately before. So Genesis 6 is actually the introduction to the flood narrative. So by implication, and there is no separation from the discussion and the introduction of these giants that goes immediately into the flood narrative. So by implication, the story is likely connected, and I'll connect that in the book and have people understand that. But we also need to understand that there were 6 generations before the giants were created. And that's when we need to understand and learn about why the Bible records the descendants of Cain and the descendants of Seth. And so Seth would be the lineage that Noah came from, and then Cain had another whole line of descendants that in prehistory also were recorded as kings. So we have this kingship concept, which is not a natural concept for our religion or old Jewish religion, because kingship didn't happen in our religion until the time of King Saul, which was thousands of years later. So the king concept is a polytheist concept that actually started in Genesis with the Nephilim and with Cain before that. But when we start digging into the Cain sort of background, what was going on in prehistory, we start to learn about the rise of the mystical religions that the Nephilim imposed over the whole people of the earth. And so then we need to learn about how this mysticism arises. And that starts with the 7 sacred sciences and the illicit knowledge that came from the fallen angels to the descendants of Cain. And so that's one of the big reasons why they were so predisposed to create this violation against the laws of creation, where the seed or the spirit of heaven was going to be married with the flesh of the earth and create gods of the earth. So one of the primary sort of doctrines of the early part of my book is I'm going to make a case that that is a violation against the laws of creation. Now, these sciences and this additional information that came from the fallen angels developed into all of the major arts and sciences that we know of today. But it's how far they were able to develop these sciences and how they were able to pervert that and to secret that knowledge. They created a mystical religion, and it was a sun worship religion. And Enoch, son of Cain, not Enoch, son of or descendant of Seth. We need to understand there's 2 Enochs in prehistory, and so Enoch, son of Cain, developed this whole knowledge base into a knowledge-based religion that people might know today as Gnosis or Gnosticism. And again, this is all connected. And so they secreted all of this advanced knowledge into these mystical religions, into an initiatory religion, which is where Freemasonry started. And actually, Freemasonry comes from Masonry, which is the 5th science of geometry. And so when we look at the craft legends from Freemasonry, understand they say and they recognize whether it's Tubal-Cain or Enoch or any of the descendants of Cain as their patriarchs.
Hey, Tricky, good to see you, mate.
These secret societies, the houses.
Hey, guys, see you tomorrow. Bye, love
this
you.
information to such a level that they claim that, and I want to understand, they claim that they created the great monuments of the world that mystifies people today, monuments like Stonehenge or monuments like the pyramids. This is their recollection, and this is the same types of secret societies that we see today. So we see this partnership that happened in the antediluvian world, and for people who don't know that word, that's just a large word or technical word for before the flood. And so we have this rise of, in the 6th generation, of the giants which usurp the kingships. They partner then with the mystical religions from the Cain line and the secret societies to govern the people, the kingships, and to build the monuments. So we have this major partnership that now becomes an answer for why is that so important in Genesis 6 leading to the flood, because violence was everywhere, evil was everywhere, and not respecting the true God of the universe and not worshiping the God was absolutely omnipresent, because they implemented this belief system universally and with force. And so by the time of Noah, only Noah and his family were not perverted by this tyranny that was going on by the Nephilim kingships and the religion that they had spun off. And thus came the flood. Okay, so let's now talk a little bit more about the religion, the sun worship, Sabaism, as some people might know of it, and relate that to the flood story in the religion of the Nephilim and the people before the flood. And I think people are going to recognize that this is very, very familiar to what actually crossed the flood as well, because again, it was the same religion. And so when we talk about the mystical religions, it is a sun worship. And I think in all the different mythologies that people know around the world and all the different religions around the world, it's basically a sun worship religion, and it's a pantheon of gods. And those are the 2 connections. And so how this connects together is that the fallen angels, and perhaps even fallen angels mating with fallen angels to create a lower set of gods in the pantheon, with the Nephilim as the earthborn gods, and the kingships at the lower level of this pantheon is the polytheist religions. And it's the same pantheon that is all around the world. It doesn't matter whether or not it's in Greece or it's in Central America or if it's India. It is the same religion, and it is the same pantheon. And so the fallen angels make up the pantheon, along with whatever they created thereafter. And so these are the same dark angels that mated with the sons or the daughters of men to create these giants. And so there's 200 of them that actually went to Mount Hermon, then started the first generation of immortal giants. And so the demons that people refer to and were also part of what they call hero worship, which comes out of Greek mythology, these were the bodiless spirits of the giants. So the first generation of giants was created immortal because they had the immortal spirit of the angels, but their bodies weren't immortal. So those bodies either died out or they committed suicide to prevent the pain of the aging body. But those spirits were not permitted into heaven. And so that's the demons that Jesus talks about in the New Testament. And the crime for creating these giants were that those dark angels, who I would call impassioned, they were locked away in the abyss. And these are the same angels in the abyss that will be released in the end time. So as a violation against the laws of creation, that was the punishment. Okay, so now we have the religion of Enoch, which is a sun-worshipping religion based in mysticism and the secret sciences and initiations and sacrifices and all sorts of what we would look at as abominations, whether it's orgies or sexual perversion and on and on and on, was all created for the flood. And so people knew that there was a apocalypse coming. And so they were forewarned by the angels, the fallen angels. And so they needed to find a way to protect this information and get it across the flood. And that's what the sons of Lamech, and just so that people understand, there's a Lamech on the Seth line and there's a Lamech on the Cain line. And that's where a lot of this sort of meshing together of the bloodlines and confusing of scripture and information as to who was who in prehistory. Those sons and daughters, and Nama was the daughter involved, they reinvigorated this religion and mysticism, and in their generation, which was the generation after the creation of the giants, and they found a way to record the information in terms of what those sciences and religions were, and where Enoch had created 9 vaults with like 36,525 books that were hidden away. And so that was how this information crossed the flood and how the religion crossed the flood. The key thing to remember is this is the same polytheist religion that we have all around the world. And I think it will resonate with people. Just as when we look at what will resonate in those cultures is all of this sort of dragon and snake imagery. And that's because the fallen angels were seraphim angels, and they had the face of a viper. And so you put wings on translucent spirit being, and you have a form of a dragon, which is also the first form in the fairy mythology, because there are 4 fairies. And in their mythology, there are the opalescent fairies that came from other planets, who produced the earthborn fairies, which is the Nephilim. And then there was the demons, or the daemons, as they would call them. And those are the spirits of the first generation of Nephilim that died out. And then you have the elemental, which is the 4th one. And there's 3 classes of little people, where now we could talk down the road about a connection to the alien mythology, because that's directly related. And so this information crossed the flood, and it turns out that person that we just talked about before, Nimrod, partners with a fellow called Hermes at Babel. And they find this information and they resurrect it. And you get a hint of how powerful this information is at Babel when it says in that story about the Tower of Babel that now, working together and speaking as one language, there is nothing that is impossible for them. And what they are building is they're building a ziggurat and a fortress very similar to what was going on in the antediluvian world. They were recreating the same rebellion that caused the flood after the flood. But the question gets to be is how did the giants survive the flood, or were they recreated after the flood? Because you could interpret Genesis 6 either way. So if we look at a second impassioned violation, and we already know that the original Nephilim, or the original fallen angels, were put into the abyss as punishment for creating the giants, then that means if there's another violation, then the next one is absolutely at a spike to recreate these giants, and it's certainly one possibility. There's nothing really in the Bible that says that there was a second impassioned violation, but if we go into other mythologies and other religions, we do get that. So let me cover off a couple of that, and I'll cover off the other possibilities of Nephilim surviving the flood. So when we go into mythology as an example that people would know, two for sure, I think, Greek mythology and Sumerian mythology. And in the Greek, not in the Greek, let's go to the Sumerian one first. The Epic of Gilgamesh is something that everybody's taught in school, and it's used as a representative argument that
Hey, Brian,
the Bible copies down the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Epic of Gilgamesh is the original text for the flood story. So they're a very similar story on the macro level, but totally different on the detail aspect of it. So when we look at Gilgamesh, here is a figure that is recorded in the book of Enoch as being before the flood and was actually aware of the flood that was coming, even though he knew there was nothing that they could do to prevent it. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, he is known as an Anunnaki, what we would call Nephilim from a Christian perspective, that survived the flood. And he was a demigod as described in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So he was part divine, part human, and he was a giant and a evil giant. And the person he tells the story to is a fellow called Enkidu. Now, Enkidu is created after the flood, and in the same manner as Gilgamesh was before the flood, and in the same manner as all giants were created around the world. And he was created as a counterbalance to prevent the evil that Gilgamesh was capable of doing and did both before and after the flood. But he becomes friends with Gilgamesh as opposed to counterbalancing, and they actually partner more into evil. So this is the second character in the preamble that's introduced in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and he too is a demigod created by the gods and a human female. And so they're telling a story about the flood story, about, depending on which language you want to translate it from, the two names that are most common are Utnapishtim and Ziusudra, as the king of Mesopotamia or Sumeria before the flood. And he takes, he's warned by the gods that there is a flood coming, and to take a similar type of an account as in Noah, to take animals on this ark, and to take many people of his family and much of his kin. So we now assume that Gilgamesh was probably akin to Ziusudra. And so he's the archetypical Anunnaki Nephilim potentate. So he's not this sort of peaceful agrarian. He's this military warrior, evil potentate that we talked about, and so is his family that he takes along with him. So just in the preamble to their flood story, we're talking about giants and their account of surviving the flood. And also in there, with Enkidu, with that creation, that also echoes a possible second violation to the laws of creation. If you look at Greek mythology, it's basically Pyrrha or Nora as the wife of Deucalion, and Noria will have several names, especially in the Gnostic religion and other mythologies, but they believe that Deucalion and Pyrrha or Noria was the same as Noah. And that's the Greek translation. Well, that's not actually true. And so what we find is that Deucalion is the son of Prometheus. And again, in the Greek mythology, Prometheus was both a god and a titan. And so we have an interesting relationship there again. So we understand this, that Deucalion was either the son of a Titan Nephilim or was a Nephilim son of Prometheus the god, but either way, he's a Nephilim. And in the Gnostic religion, they believe Norea is just a derivative of Nama, which was one of the descendants of Cain and daughter of Lamech that we had just talked about. So now we have a combining of the story of another Nephilim survival. And when we look at all the accounts of prehistory, most of the accounts of prehistory in other religions and other mythologies are actually the survival of giants on an ark, or they went to a mountain. And there are some other stories about humans, but the ones that survive are the survival accounts of giants. And if we also look to the Gnostic religion, which has a Christian sort of gloss to it, but it is distinctly polytheist and it is distinctly the old religion, they also have an account of a particular character in prehistory called Seth, but this would be Anamaka Seth, and this would be another race of giants that was created in a cloud, so sort of a DNA manipulation as another account that would be similar to what might be happening in the alien mythology. So we do have an account of DNA manipulation and creating a superhuman Nephilim in prehistory from the Gnostic religions, just as we can look at other DNA manipulation with centaurs and other beings that just aren't around anymore, and particularly the crossbreeding of species and things like that. And also in the Gnostic religion, they have a very, very specific accounts and several accounts of Sodom and Gomorrah, and that these were not cities of evil, because in the polytheist belief system, these were cities of light, cities of knowledge. And they believe that in these writings, at least it says in these writings, that there was another planting of this race, the giant race, in Sodom and in Gomorrah after the flood. So we take from that they record another violation against the laws of creation. So we have a couple different ways. We have both ways that are possible, and perhaps both did happen. And if we look at the biblical account to say, is that possible at Sodom and Gomorrah, that's where the second violation occurred? It is very possible, because in Genesis 14, we talk about a war of 4 kings against 5, and there's a Mesopotamian alliance that invades the Middle East. And all these nations that are listed are giant nations, whether it's the Amorites or the Amalekites or the Abites or the Emites, and on and on and on and on. And there's several battles that take place. And this is at the time of Abraham and Lot. That's the invading army from Mesopotamia that Lot is taken captive of, that we're talking about. And then shortly thereafter, Sodom is destroyed. So there's a definite connection that Nephilim were there. They were the kings of the civilizations after the flood and after Babel, and likely a large reason for destroying Sodom and Gomorrah and why it had descended so far down into abominations and evil. And so if we look again scripturally, how were giants able to survive the flood? And when we take into account that the flood story says that basically all human beings were wiped out, all land creatures were wiped out. So how can this be? So it's either somehow they survived the flood, or there was a second violation against the flood. Now I'm going to bring in something that people kind of overlook. It does say in the flood story that the flood was designed to wipe out all the life forms that were created by God. And so you have a possible skirting or very specific wording that did not include beings created by fallen angels. And so when you understand that fallen angels were created through the daughters of men, perhaps not all of them were wiped out, and perhaps the stories of prehistory are true, with all of these different cultures around the world recording that these giants actually survived the flood, either going to a mountain or into a cloud or on an ark. Okay, now let's also look at, I think people overlook very often is the Table of Nations in First Chronicles and in Genesis. And the Tables of Nations does is it records Noah and his 3 sons and all of their descendants. Well, all of a sudden we have very early in Genesis, all of these nations like the Rephaites and the Anakites that do not descend out of the Table of Nations. So again, they either survived the flood or there was another recreation. And it can be either. I actually, at times I say it's one and sometimes I say it's the other. Actually, the more I think about it and the more time goes, I think it's probably both. And there are so many nations that survived the flood, or they somehow seemingly survived the flood because their names got to come out of nowhere. So when we look at Seir in the Table of Nations, Seir's name enters as a people who, the descendants of Esau, son of Isaac, married into. And these people come out of nowhere. And these are the Amalekites and the Horites. And there again is nothing recorded there in the Table of Nations or in the Old Testament to say how these people came about. And so when we look further into the Old Testament and we talk about the Amalekites, this is the beginning of another intermarriage and a hybrid population of giants being created that was totally anti descendants of Isaac and Jacob. And so we can also look at accounts of other peoples that aren't giants that somehow survived the flood, somehow, some way, because again, their names come out of nowhere and they are not part of the Table of Nations. And few of those ones, just to name an example, would be the Kenites and the Kenizzites. And of course, their history would say that they actually descended from Tubal-Cain. And so when we talk about the Kenizzites and the Kenites saying that they go back to descend back to Tubal-Cain, that's why we see this sort of mythos, this mythology that continues through religions and entertainment of people surviving the flood and descending back to Tubal-Cain. And probably the clearest one and most recent one was the recent movie about the flood and Noah, and where they insert Tubal-Cain being on the flood, on the ark, and surviving the flood. And that's a 100% Gnostic belief, where they believe that 2 of the sons for sure, and in some accounts they'll say Noah was Nephilim as well, but they believe that Tubal-Cain and Ham were the descendants of Tubal-Cain, and they were not the sons of Noah. And so again, you have to understand this is a different religion, a different belief system, but this belief system is everywhere and impacts all of our society. So we see those belief systems inserted in very strange and odd spots all the time. And when we talk about an ongoing mythos, I mean, I think so many people are probably familiar with this series on History Channel with Ancient Aliens. And I watch Ancient Aliens all the time. I don't think there's a show that I miss, because I like the information that they bring in. I understand their perspective. I don't agree with their perspective, but what they're talking about is that the gods of ancient prehistory were actually aliens and not gods. And so there's not a whole lot of difference in terms of how they're trying to explain it, except that from a biblical perspective, these aliens were the fallen angels, very advanced beings, and they're saying they just weren't quite as advanced. They're just more advanced than people of prehistory. So the accounts that they bring in are extraordinarily relevant and pertinent, but for a Christian, just understand it from their perspective and then relate to it as to what Scripture says. And then when we talk about this mythos, we're talking about what everybody looks at as the little gray aliens. I think everybody recognizes that most aliens are these little grays. Well, when we talked about the 4 classes of fairies, there are 3 subsets, and in the one subset is called the subset of gnomes and goblins and sprites. And these were ugly little fairies. They weren't the pretty little ones with wings and everything that you see like in Disney and in Shakespeare and things like that. But these little ones, they had a section called the little greys, the grey neighbors, as they were known in Scotland. And so these little goblins were identical to the descriptions of the little greys that we know of today and in the sightings. And what's important about that is that these greys had flying machines, and they're offering technology and the ability to evolve, and they would kidnap people and return them. They would do DNA experimentation on them. They were looking to create hybrids. And in my book, I'll give an abduction by a fairy, by a gray neighbor, that you will find absolutely amazing. And if you didn't know it was an abduction by a fairy, a little people, you would think it was an alien abduction. So again, we see little people and these four classes of fairies. We see this all throughout history and all throughout our entertainment and all throughout mythology. And so if you go to the Ring of the Lords in Tolkien, you see these little people, a number of them, not all of them, because there's many kinds of little people. And what they're trying to tell us, or what they believe, is that many of these little people and other beings survive. And if you look at the end of Tolkien, and it's sort of in Lord of the Rings, you have all of these beings going away on a boat. It's kind of has an imagery of an ark. So we take that probably at the time of the flood and the ark, that these beings went away and that they survive today. Because what Tolkien says is it's now the age of humankind. And also in fairy mythology, just as in alien mythology, many people believe that these spaceships come through portals. And in the fairy mythology, whether it's a Shay, spelled S-I-D-H-E, or a fairy mound, or as in King Arthur, the ladies of the
Thank you,
guarded
glad you like the channel, bro.
to the other world. And so you see this incredible parallel of imagery and mythology with the alien mythology in just so many ways to what we're talking about with fairies and with aliens. And of course, the fairy mythology goes back to the bloodlines and the descendants of giants. And the Tuatha De Danann, which are sort of the home race of the fairy race, were Nephilim, and they were the offspring of the fairies in Ireland in the Celtic mythology. When we look at the bloodlines that survive on these kingships of Nephilim, there is a dragon bloodline, which is the male bloodline, and there is a fairy bloodline, which is the matriarchy. And both of those, in both imagery and in importance in tracking the genealogy of the giants, is very, very important. And so that's why we see the fairy mythos and the dragon mythos, whether it's Dracula or snake imagery. These are all the imagery of the kingships and the bloodlines. And when we understand that, we start to understand why all of this is kept alive in so many aspects, whether it's literature, whether it is entertainment, whether it's science fiction. And it has been that way throughout 6,000 years, because it's the imagery and the allegories of the mystical religion and the kingships and the bloodlines that have descended down through the generations. Okay, so let's start bringing this together a little bit more. And so what's the purpose of the other side, or the descendants of giants, and how and why do they want to enslave humankind? So let's again go first back to prehistory. So whether or not you're talking about the Greek Titan rebellion or the rebellion of the Nephilim against God, it's the same story. So in prehistory, we had the universal religion, we had giants, we had a rebellion against God. And so that brought about the first apocalypse. And in prehistory, they managed to enslave humankind. And so the creation of these giants, these snake-like beings, because they look...
And Gary is very humble. He goes on channels that only have like 2,000 subscribers. He's very humble. He's very generous with his time. He's very intelligent, and he explains his premises pretty easily. They're easy to understand.
just like
He's actually brilliant, isn't he, guys?
the seraphim angels are fathers in the first generations. They don't look like that today as a descendant or as a bloodline. But what Lucifer, what Satan was trying to do was take his revenge out, because all of this is connected back to the angelic rebellion. And so humankind is destined to be raised higher than angels. And this is not what the rebellious angels want. So this is all part of the angelic rebellion. And so when prophecy talks about rebellion, it will come about again in the end days, just as it did in the antediluvian period, where the first apocalypse came. And the second apocalypse will be by fire, not by water. And so when these forces and partnerships revived after the flood, we see the first rebellion taking place, and again to enslave humankind and bring on the universal mystical religion. We see this at Babel, where Nimrod is the Antichrist figure, and he usurps absolute control, and usurping of power is one of the sort of common traits to the Antichrist. And so he usurps power as king. They bring in the mystical religion. They force everybody to worship. They develop the 7 sacred sciences, and they're going to rebel against God. And if humankind actually succeeds in the rebellion against God, the dark angels win. And so they need to enslave us. And so God stepped in and confused the languages so that it wouldn't happen again until the time that's been ordained, which is the end time. And so we will see another rebellion, another stand against God, just as it occurred before the flood and at Babel. And so when we look shortly after the flood, these Nephilim, either from a recreation or surviving the flood, they once more usurped all of the main kingships after the flood. And so when we look at the Amalekite dynasty, the Egyptian dynasty, the Sumerian or the Akkadian or the Mesopotamian dynasties, the Mitanni dynasty, the Hittite dynasties, these are all Nephilim dynasties. And these bloodlines exist today. And they exist today in the royal families. And so most of the royal families, and they have genealogies to prove it. At least that's what they say. And they also have genealogists, and Lawrence Gardner has written many books about it as being a royal genealogist. They have the ability to take those genealogies all the way back into prehistory and all the way back to the giants. And so this bloodline is existing today, and that's why I call it the descendants of giants, or the bloodlines of the giants. And what these bloodlines are designed to do, and have been designed to do all throughout history, is to be kept pure, to introduce the Antichrist. And so I will make a case in the book that the Antichrist of the end time will be a bloodline, or at least they will present him as a bloodline descending down from the giants. So now we're connecting these ancient bloodlines to the royal families around the world, and some of the most powerful families in the world. And so a question that a lot of people will have is so why aren't they giants today, and why don't they have the face of a serpent today? And so there's schools of thought. But I would encourage people, if they ever get a chance to go see a King Tut display, look for a statue of Akhenaten, and that would be circa 1400 BC. And if you look at that face, you're still seeing many facial features that are snake-like or figure-like in terms of the slanted eyes and the extended chin and the sloped forehead. And you can see through prehistory, there's a significant amount of elongated skulls, and you'll see that in Egyptian history as well, and even as late as in Akhenaten. And try and keep the bloodlines as pure as they can. They still have to bring in other bloodlines, otherwise diseases and genetic things will come in. So they'll reintroduce bloodlines from related families that may have some human bloodlines, refreshing the bloodlines. And so there's been a sort of a long continual dilution over time, which is what most people will believe as to why they've come down to a size that of a normal human for the most part, and they don't have the same features as they did even 3,000 years ago, or maybe even 2,000 years ago. And then the other theory, which I'm not necessarily a fan of, but if people really get in deep into the genre, there's a specific genre about the lizard people, and that they have changeling qualities. That's possible, I suppose. I'm not a fan of that particular one, but there is a large following out there that says that they have the ability to duplicate what a human looks like, and when they're in private, they look like a lizard. I think that's pure speculation. I don't think there's any proof of that. And just as there's a lot of talk about the bloodlines of the royals is an Rh negative bloodline, and that's the actual bloodline of the Nephilim. Again, there's nothing to really prove that other than it's not a natural human bloodline, but they don't offer their blood out for research. And if they do, it's all internal because they really don't want to get this out. But within the mythology, whether it's a bloodline, a special marker in the bloodline, or a special marker in the DNA, they do believe in this, and they call that the gene of Isis, which is their, they say that their belief is that's the belief of how the word Genesis came about. So you have the gene of Isis and Genesis, and so if you look at Isis, that was the wife of Osiris, and they were gods or fallen angels, and then they had Nephilim with the same names underneath, and so that's where they say the gene of Isis comes from, and that is still out there today. And in the end time, they're going to collect all of the people who have the gene of Isis, and those are the people that are going to rule the next world, not the average humankind. So they have no real need for humankind. And so when we start to roll this forward, and this seems like all speculation, but I'll follow throughout the book this history that has taken place and how they've affected history. But when we bring that into the modern time, we have to look to what are they doing today? Well, if we look at the world today, it is being prepared for world government.
Yep.
It is being prepared for the end times, and this is all the work of the...
Okay, this is 3 years old, guys, so this is just before the pandemic.
Secret societies and the other religion and the bloodlines of the giant, because they want to bring about the end time. They want to bring about the Antichrist. They would prefer to do it not at the ordained time. They would prefer to do it any time other than the ordained time, but they will take the ordained time if they have to, and they will. So if we start looking at what's shaping our politics today and what's shaping the belief systems and the education systems and all the propaganda that is out there, it is all the same imagery and all of the same belief system and all of the same organizations that were there before. So if we go back to prehistory, we had world government in their belief system that came out of the Atlantean mythology, and Atlantis was the helm of world government. They're trying to create the new Atlantis. You wonder why we're just inundated with Atlantean mythology, where they were reigned over by 10 kings that were Nephilim kings in the antediluvian world, and we're inundated with it because they want to create the new Atlantis, and those are the exact new words that they will use for the new age. And Bacon, who is a very famous person from history and was a Rosicrucian in Freemasonry, he wrote a book called The New Atlantis. And what he's referring to is an age, a new golden age, where there is a world government that partners with a mystical religion and is reigned over by one leader. And that was the inspiration for the Royal Society, where all of our science has come back today. And that the Royal Society was just created as an ability to advance sciences and the religion and to worship and honor the great architect of the universe, whom they call Lucifer. And so when we understand that all the education systems and all the belief systems and all the entertainment, it's all connected and it's all inspired by these same organizations, it's not surprising that we see developing today this concept of world government. It's an ancient concept. They want one government that they can rule over, just as they did in antediluvian times and at Babel, with one sun-worshipping Babel relationship, or as it's known in the end times, Babylon, and that they're going to have one king over there who will usurp kingship, which will be a modern Nimrod or a modern Nephilim. So they're working at bringing about world government. And if we look to Daniel and to Revelations, we now find that the Bible prophesizes 10 world empires, or 10 empires, 10 kings. This is the Atlantean mythology manifested, but predicted within the Bible. And so you see, again, the same story being told, the same end game, it's just who's going to win. And we see world government rising not through somebody like a Stalin or a Hitler trying to march across the world and conquer the world. We see it rising as a platform that the Antichrist will just be able to take control of. And so when we look at NAFTA or the EEC or whatever these trading blocks that are rising, look not for 10 specific nations, look for 10 groups of nations, 10 spheres of influence, 10 regions that will unite and have one representative that goes and begins world government. But just as before, we have to have the universal religion, the mystical religion, as part of that partnership to make all of this happen. And that's why you see this war against Christianity, why it's going out of the schools. Soon, everything about Christianity and the constitutions which were designed with this in mind will be used to persecute and sideline Christians, because Christians and monotheists are their only stumbling blocks. And they're progressively, and I use that word specifically, they're progressively working towards this through left-wing politics, which are the progressives. And they've tried to create this many, many times. And the last most recent one, and it's a perfect analogy, and I'll cover it off in the book, is the rise of the Third Reich. So you have an Antichrist figure, you have the mystical religion, you have the Third Reich, the 1,000-year reign that they're trying to recreate. You have the slaughter of the Jewish people, and then it would have also been the Christians thereafter. It is an exact Antichrist type prototype, just as Nimrod was. So again, what was before is going to be again. So they work at bringing about these things through specific secret societies. And you remember us talking about Freemasonry and Masonry in ancient forms. Well, Nimrod was the first founder of the Masonic secret societies at Babel, and he wrote the first constitution. And then it was revitalized and reformatted the Constitution at Heliopolis in Egypt. And that same organization, with many genitive organizations, has survived ever since. And we know that today as the Rosicrucians. We know that as the Freemasonry organizations. We know that as the Illuminati, and then all the different organizations that they have spun off. And that would be including the Gnostic religions, which they worship at their center, which created Theosophy, which also created New Age. We will recognize these groups as groups like the Bilderbergers, that they were taking all the new money and utilizing them to influence the world and meeting in secrecy, just as the Bohemian society that meets in California is, again, about new money, not the old money, not the true bloodlines. Understand there's a hierarchy involved here. So Freemasonry has lower levels, and then at the 33rd degree, they become illuminated and become an adept. And then from the Illuminati and from the enlightened people at the 33rd degree, the Illuminati drafts those adepts. And so that's the inner part. And then those people who have some bloodlines, some noble bloodlines, and who are able to continue to progress with enlightenment, they are drafted into the Rosicrucians. And above the Rosicrucians is the Council of 300. And the Council of 300 comes from the 13 families of the pure bloodlines. And then you go back to the 13 bloodlines. And within that upper tier group, they're going to keep 3 Antichrist figures ready to go at any time, raised from childhood, illuminated in levels that a Rosicrucian of a lower level wouldn't have, or Illuminati wouldn't have, but they've got an Antichrist figure ready to go all of the time. Some of the other organizations that these secret societies and families fund, people might remember the Skull and Bones. And so the Skull and Bones is just another one of these organizations, and what their main thing to do is out of Yale in particular, they're going to draft in the pseudo blue bloods from the United States. And when they talk about pseudo blue bloods, that's again the bloodlines. It's just not as pure as the ones that came across from Europe, but it's the American pure bloods. And of course, those families tend to intermarry. But the people being drafted into the Skull and Bones, they're the people going into all of these government organizations to control government. And so most of them go into an organization called the CFR first. And that's the Council of Foreign Relations. So if you look at any political shows and interviews, they're going to bring on these advisors and people when they're talking about politics, and many of them are going to come from the CFR. This is from that organization, and it's their job to bring about world government. And there's not just the CFR that's an organization. You have the Bilderbergers, and they were doing the same thing, only from a European perspective. And that organization, their end product was the EEC. And we talked about that earlier as one of those rising empires, just as we look at NAFTA as part of a North American entity that's going to form into these 10 world governments. And then there's another organization that people might be familiar with, is the Trilateral Organization. And they were created for Europe, United States, and Japan, the 3 biggest economies in the 70s, to again find a way to bring the world together as one government. That's their charter. There's another interesting group, and there's many of these webs that are working. The Leviathan.
Yeah, Ryu, he's pouring out his gifts on his people, isn't he?
Of this organization is so immense, people can't imagine it. I can't imagine it. It's just everywhere. But there's one that sort of brings us full circle, is an organization called the Club of Rome. And the Club of Rome is an organization that was organized to bring about world government with, you guessed it, 10 empires, 10 blocks of countries. And they were organized in the late 60s and the early 70s. So this organization is above the Bilderbergers and is getting very close to the Council of 300 with its members. So very, very powerful members that are in this with pure bloodlines. And so not only do they want 10 empires, this is where, and people might find this controversial, they decided they needed certain policies to cattle herd people, things that could cross borders and get people to move into a direction of a world without borders. And so they came up with so much of the environmental protest and policies. They fund that. They came up with, if you can believe this or not, the great overpopulation scare. So they're creating these apocalyptic policies from the 60s and 70s that they're continuing to use today. They created the doctrine of peak oil to, again, help cattle herd and manipulate markets. And also, what I think people will find interesting, it doesn't matter whether or not you're a fan of or a believer in global warming or not, that's their doctrine. They introduced that one at the same time. And so their job is to cattle herd people into world government. And so we have all of these different institutions that are working together. And if we go back before Freemasonry, there was an organization called the Knights Templar. And the Templars were founded by these same bloodlines and these same organizations. And what the Templars did was they created modern banking. And so whether it was a check or credit facilities, and they grew wealthy over lending money to all of the various monarchies to wage their wars. And when they were broken up, these organizations needed to reassemble, and they split into several different groups. And so Freemasonry, through Scotland, where it originated and where some of the surviving Templars went, was one aspect of it. And that was more or less the political aspect, and it grew with the expansion of the British Empire and with the French Empire. And so they also needed to replace the banking arm. Well, there was a family in Germany who was working for some of the German bloodlines, was brought in to be the bankers, and that was the Bauer family. And then when they grew rich and powerful and became the banking arm of the agenda of these bloodlines and organizations, they moved to England, to London. And they felt they should change their name. And coincidentally, most people will be familiar with the family called the Rothschilds. That's who the Bauer family is, and they were created to fund these organizations. Then the Rothschilds, they drafted many families in the United States and made them wealthy, and they're loyal to the Rothschilds today. So if we talk about the Carnegies, or we talk about the Warburgs, or if we talk about J.P. Morgan, and in particular the Rockefellers, all of these families were funded by the Rothschilds, and they're totally loyal today. And these are sort of that heart of that pseudo blue blood line that goes back to the Rothschilds, who aren't as pure as the 13 families, because this was a less pure line that was brought in after the demise of the Templars. But they were the banking arm. Now, the profits from the banks, let me back up a step first. Note that all the reserve banks in the world are owned by the banks. They're not government owned. And the Rothschilds own most of the banks, and the rest of the banks that are the ownership of the reserve banks were funded and created by the Rothschilds to act as their stable agents. Now, the profits that the banking industry makes, not in all countries, but particularly in the US, they can move their profits to trusts and not be taxed on it. And so you'll have the Rockefeller Trust and the Morgan Trust, and there's just an incredible amount of these trusts. These trust organizations are used to sponsor their concepts, their agenda, their ideas, bring about the acceptability of world government, to affect policy and teaching in schools, whatever they want on the agenda, that's what they're funded to do. And we see that happen throughout our universities, throughout our schools today, throughout what happens in the media. It's all working from this tax-free money coming from the banks. Look in behind any organization, just look at the symbology. So if you've got anything that has a, let's say for an example, derivative of Lucifer, whether it's Lucent or anything like that, and there used to be a company called Lucent Technologies that had the red dragon as their icon, and their address was 666 on a street in New York. So they are very arrogant, but people don't look. But you have to understand the language that they're talking about. And so what they're really trying to do is just sort of get people used to the concept, so that this isn't such a big surprise, so that when world government comes about, you're ready for it. When socialism, when they want to create a socialist government, you're used to it, because you've seen these ideologies all throughout, that Christianity isn't a religion that you can trust in, that the New Testament isn't accurate, the Old Testament isn't. These are all the doctrines of what they're trying to do. And when you see the imageries, whether it's with the alien mythos, look for the religion that's in the alien mythos. It's mysticism. It's Eastern mysticism. If it's evolution being taught in school, understand that comes out of Eastern mysticism. It's a mystical concept. It's not about that you just live and die. It's that it's part of recreation, that your spirit will evolve over time to become a god. So it's a different spin, a different belief system into godhood, just as Eden, the big doctrine out of Eden is eat from the tree of good and evil so you can be like God. The whole doctrine is that they're going to try and deceive us into that we believe that we can rebel against what they would call the evil God and follow the good God, which they believe is Lucifer, and that you're going to...
Yeah, Brian, I've done Tim Cohen's King Charles one. I've done it twice actually. So yeah, that's why I say he's a good candidate. I'm not quite on board that he's the Antichrist, but he certainly, Tim Cohen does put a good argument together to make him a candidate to be one of the Antichrists. But I think the Antichrist will come from Antarctica, and that's who the elite were visiting in 2016. Apparently, they were visiting the king of the world down in Antarctica. So that's where I think it's coming from.
Be able to evolve into gods and vibrate as the New Age religion would suggest, because you are worthy, you're part of the bloodlines, you're being educated, and you have all of these knowledge that they have provided, because they believe knowledge is absolutely essential to evolve into godhood. And so anything that you see today, you need to critically take a step back and critically ask tough questions about why is it being presented in this manner? Because once you start asking those questions and you understand the imagery and the organizational structure, you're going to see what's going on. And so the point of the matter is not only to get people to understand so they can decode what's going on, it's just hopefully more people will understand, because everybody's going to have to make a choice. And to be able to choose properly and understand what is going on is going to be so key, because we're told in prophecy that even the elect will be deceived if that were possible. And so that means our church leaders are going to be deceived, and they are going to come at us from a religious perspective. The only way they can bring on a polytheist, and for those who don't understand the word polytheist, that's worshiping many gods, as in a pantheon. Only way they can bring on a polytheist mystical religion is destroy Christianity. And so they're going to come at us, and that's why you see books like the Da Vinci Code. It's why you see so many things going on to prepare us. They're going to present to us that Jesus did not die on the cross. And this is straight Gnostic belief, because Gnostics believe they're Christians. They just don't believe in a divine Jesus, and that he was a prophet like Buddha and all these other prophets from the past. And Jesus was just like them, an important prophet, but a prophet and immortal nonetheless. So they're going to attack the resurrection, the virgin birth, and they're going to attack Paul, who is sponsorship of most of the New Testament, and they have to destroy those concepts. And they believe they have the proof to do that. That's part of the secrets and the knowledge that they have. And unless you're totally prepared and understand what they're going to be talking about, you too might be deceived. So learn from prehistory, read the book, understand how to decode the times. And one of the most significant examples of preparing people for the end times and the propaganda and the imagery that goes with it is go look at pretty much any of the major holidays that we celebrate in North America today. And you're going to see they're inundated with this imagery, with this allegory, and with this distortion. And so we have All Hallows Eve, which everybody is familiar with, and it's about devils and witches, and that's all part of the belief system. They believe it's good, not evil, like what we do, but it's a different perspective. We look at Easter. That goes back to Ishtar, and the eggs are the fertility eggs, and all back into this ancient prehistory of Nephilim and gods and mating with human females to create giants. It's not the resurrection that is known for, it's Easter. And those are the same gods as, whether it's Ishtar, it's also known as Isis in Egypt, it's the same god, or Ashtaroth, as people might pick up, and variations of Ashtaroth in the Bible, or so many other names. Gaia would be the counterpart in Greek mythology. So Easter has been taken away with the bunny rabbit, fertility eggs, and with a female goddess, and not from the superficial imagery about the resurrection. And we look at Christmas the same way. Well, we know it's not, but that's a sun worship takeover at the time of Constantine to homogenize the empire, to bring in mystical religions. Of Mithraism was the main one of that time, but the Manichaeans were also part of this, which is all part of the same type of religions and ancient religions that Gnosticism and Theosophy and New Age come from. So there was this sort of combining of dates and imagery into what we know as Christianity's birth with the Roman Empire, as opposed to the Jerusalem church and the original birth. So it changed radically in that form, and we see halos, which is part of the Egyptian religion. We see images of Jesus and the baby Jesus, which is an image of Isis, Osiris, and Horus as the Trinity, and on and on and on, including December 25th. And so when we look at the Mithraic religion being introduced into Christmas, and that he also rose after 3 days. So we see a blending in on this, and on the 25th and the solstice, typical polytheist religion sort of overlapping it. I think it's fine that we celebrate and also acknowledge that we ought to celebrate the birth of Jesus. Just understand that that date has been manipulated when Constantine brought the religion to the Roman Empire. Then we also look at the modern sort of manipulation of Christmas, where we introduce Santa Claus, and everybody thinks Santa Claus goes back to St. Nicholas. Well, this is not a St. Nicholas doing good for poor children and poor people. This is a fairy mythology inserted into Christmas. And the elves are part of the fairy mythology that we talked about before. And these little ugly elves, they focused on the naughty list and what they did to the children in an evil sort of way to the children that weren't good. And this individual, that Santa Claus, was not St. Nicholas and was a different character in the story. So this is another piece of fairy mythology that's just designed to take our belief system away and fool people. And it's a way of degrading Christianity in a way where people like to have a celebration that sounds good and everybody likes to do, but at the end of the day, it's slander against Christianity. And so I think we need to understand that the history and the meaning that's behind these allegories are things we need to learn, and they're there for a reason, and they're not there for the betterment of Christianity.
Okay, I got some more Gary Wayne and his fairy stuff.
All right. Well, thank you, Gary, for coming on. What are some things that you've been up to?
Nothing that's really new, other than I continue to put out commentaries kind of on a weekly basis. So I finished a series on Isaiah 13 and 14 and the dual prophecies of that, and tying that into Abaddon and into the Abyss and to Azazel, and quite an extensive series on that. I did starting a series that I did last week on the veracity of the giants being part of the Exodus and the Nephilim Wars, and giving people more detail on that. So continuing to give more information that's not really in my book, that I have used for research over the years, but to give it in more detail. And I also have a conference that I'll be attending in November. I'll be there from November 8th to 11th in Dallas. That's at the Operation Top Secret conference. That information should be out shortly on, and should be a well-attended conference.
Well, hey, Gary, that sounds very exciting. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about fairies and leprechauns and other mythical creatures. I know the last time you came on, you kind of alluded to them at the end of our conversation. So I just figured that I'd ask you more about them today, and just ask you to expand upon that topic a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that's such an interesting subject, and very, very sort of in-depth subject, particularly as you get into it from the polytheist side in terms of the religions and mythologies around the world.
Thank you for being a friend.
So there's a lot of, literature and classics, literature and entertainment today that's all based on related topics of all of this that go back into, the time of prehistory. So, if you're talking about fairies, for example, you're talking about 4 different classifications of the fairy mythos, and it's also regarded as a religion as well as the legends and mythologies around it. So, and in that classification, you have the rebellious fairies that come to this world. So they're very much akin to the gods or to the fallen angels in the Bible. And they're opalescent beings. So they're shining, transparent, spirit-like beings. And they create a second class, which are the earthborn fairies, which are also shining, but they're not quite the same. These are the demigods or the Nephilim or the Tuatha De Danann that people might be familiar with as a Tuatha De Danann, I should say, that most people are aware of that, are out of Ireland and up into the Norse mythology. They're the same peoples and into the Scottish mythologies. And then you have the third class, which are the bodiless spirits, or the shades, or the banshee type of demon spirit. And then the third one is very, very interesting, which is more sort of equivalent to what you're talking about, is the elementals. And that is split into 3 categories around the world. And it's interesting that, we don't get little people being talked about in the Bible, but we get it everywhere else in the world. And so around the world, there's a constant of basically 3 sort of categories that are out there. So you have the mischievous ones, like the pixies, like the Manaway, like the leprechaun. You have the good-looking ones, and some of them are, depicted, as like a Tinkerbell type fairy. And in various different sizes of those good-looking ones. And then you have the ugly ones, which are the ones that are like the hobbits and are like the dwarves and are like the trolls and are the gnomes, and very much sort of slides more akin into a lot of the ancient alien mythos in terms of their descriptions and the agendas that they have. And so you get these 3 classifications all around the world: North American Indians, Southeast Asia, all throughout Europe. As I say, on all continents, there's an accounting of these little people. And typically they have a connection back to certain gods. And so they are a creation of the gods. And depending on which pantheon that you're looking at, depends on which god sort of created them. Although I do think the pantheons are essentially the same, just different vernacular names around the world. And so these little people, are created, like the Nereids in the Atlantean mythology, for example, would be one example. And there, again, this goes to that concept in the antediluvian world that not only were giants and titans and cyclops and other giant creatures that were created in the ancient world, but you also have these little people that are part of the same sort of mythology. And so the gnomes are a very interesting one because they looked after the knowledge and the genealogies of the ancient ones and guarded certain portals to the other world. And in the fairy mythology, it's filled with portals to different worlds, and they're called Shays, just as the Tuatha De Danann are also called the Shay people. And you also have fairy domens that are all around the world, and these are like mini Stonehenge type structures that are portals to the other world. And domen means portal, so fairy domen, fairy portal. So you have the creation of these things, and there are just so many of them. And what's interesting about that is they absolutely inundate, our literature and current movies and things like that, just as the superheroes do. And that's all because they're related. So what we're talking about in the antediluvian world is either through technology or through gods and angels, and or angels, depending on your perspective as to who they are, either copulating with animals, copulating with people to create these hybrid types of beings, which goes to that essential aspect of what's wrong with creating the Nephilim, because it was a violation against the laws of creation. And this created with the Nephilim a immortal spirit in flesh, which was not permitted in the physical world. An immortal spirit belongs only in the heavenly dwelling places, or other dimensions, or in heaven, however you want to look at that. And so this concept of these beings that are being created are absolutely crazy in terms of some of the things that are mentioned in prehistory. Simple things like flying horses. Okay, that maybe isn't that big of a stretch with the Pegasus, but you also have the centaurs, and these are half human, half horse type of being that are created in a cloud somewhere, according to Greek mythology. So again, that's why I say we're not really sure whether or not that's a copulation or that is some sort of DNA manipulation. And you've got even crazier beings that are out there. So it's just almost an unlimited Pandora's box, so to speak, of all of these different types of creations that I think we need to take more seriously than just part of the imagination, because it goes with all of the religions and the legends right around the world. So
when did these entities exist?
Hi, I'm Nathan Ankovis. I'm the artist in residency at Skate. Bringing in who you are to your work will inevitably make your work unique. Creativity is all about originality.
Yeah. Typically, when we're talking about these types of beings, it seems to be rather consistent that this is sometime after Eden and sometime before the flood. Now, there may have been some limited types of these things that were happening after the flood, because we do get some of these creatures sort of showing up, either being recreated or somehow surviving the flood in different accounts around the world. But typically they are sort of antediluvian in kind of nature. And I think one of the best examples to match this up from a biblical and from a mythological and other religions around the world perspective is we look at Revelation 9, for example. And for people who may not be, who are listening, familiar with Revelation 9, this is when the abyss is opened. And the abyss is the location where the impassioned fallen angels, and perhaps the worst of their creations, and the other unimpassioned, and the worst of the other unimpassioned angels and gods, were locked away for the crimes that they created in that antediluvian period, whereby it corrupted the whole world, not just with violence, but everything's corrupted, from the genomes to the DNAs to everything that's going on. And out of the abyss in Revelation 9, which is an end time prophecy, you have coming out, being led by Abaddon and Apollyon, which are the same being, which is the leader of these creatures in the abyss. You have these scorpion beings, right? So who are these scorpion beings? And a lot of people like to allegorize that like as their helicopters and fancy sort of technology. And I think in my approach is that I like to define things out of prehistory as it goes to understanding end time prophecy. So if we look back into prehistory and into Sumerian history, you have a goddess named Tiamat. And she's a mother of a number of crazy looking beings. And these are like the Hydra, which most people are familiar with, the multi-headed snake. And you have the dragon, and they call a hairy hero. You have the great demon, you have a savage dog, you have a scorpion man, you have other demons, fishmen, bullmen, and they had these really powerful weapons. And Tiamat had created these gods to control and attack where necessary the lower gods. So you have the primary gods in prehistory, and then you have the secondary gods. And those secondary gods might be, the gods of Mount Olympus, where you have Zeus, who everybody recognizes, and then in the primary gods would be Kronos, which would be the first sort of seven. And that's kind of, again, one of these constants that are around the world. So Tiamat is Sumerian pantheon, one of these primary gods. And so it's usually to keep the secondary gods in line that the scorpion beings are created. And so they're known in the Epic of Gilgamesh as the Akrab-Buamalu or the Gerda-Balu. And here's kind of how they're described in sort of a paraphrasing of it. It is, they are large beings with the head and the torso and the arms of a man or a human. They had the body of a scorpion. They had the legs of a bird and the feet of the bird, so they would have had claws. They had wings to fly, and they had powerful destructive weaponry that were launched by some sort of bow and arrow type of weaponry, and they stung their prey from their tails that had venom. This is pretty much the exact same description that is described in Revelation 9 that comes out of the abyss with the bat and Apollyon. And I have a commentary if people want this, and great pictures of these beings as to what they look like that are on reliefs and etchings and things that are out of the ancient world. Very, very interesting commentary that sort of links all of this together. But again, these were a creation of the gods. And it's a crazy example where you start to look at prehistory, some of the things that are going on, and then you look into prophecy as to what it's saying in the Bible, and you have this crazy connection. And if you take the word scorpion in Hebrew, that goes back to a word that's spelled A-Q-R-A-B, or crab. Just as I mentioned, they were described by the Sumerians as Akrab Umalu. So it's very much rooted in the same sort of etymology, and the other name was Gerda-Balu. And so these are very, very crazy monsters. And then they were used after Tiamat was slain to protect the gateways to the underworld and to the abyss, and to protect the sun, the great sun temples around the earth from obviously the enemies, whoever they might be, depending on which pantheon that you're talking about. So that's just kind of the tip of the earth, of the iceberg, so to speak, as to what was likely going on in prehistory.
Do these entities still exist today?
Well, a lot of people think that that is the case. I don't think we have much in terms of solid, hard evidence of that. But you do hear about sort of urban legends, so to speak, of the dog man and things like that. And you've got the Bigfoot, which also has connections back into prehistory as well. And you still got all of these legends of the little people. And what's interesting about the little people, so I'm going to answer your question quickly and then just talk a little bit more about the little people. So I think we don't have much evidence. I think there's a likelihood that some of these creatures did survive. I don't know which ones, but if I would look towards one that has the most likelihood that we can say is still around today, I would look at the little people, because in that classification that I talked about, that was the gnomes. There's this one classification that has great technology, and the gnomes were the ones who also kept the genealogies of the bloodlines of the Nephilim and the giants, and also kept the records of all the knowledge that they collected in the antediluvian world, which I think was greater than we have today, because we're not quite in the end time yet. And I base that on Jesus' prophecy of the end time. The days are going to be like Noah. And I obviously take that beyond just the violence and marriage that was going on. I take it on to the whole corruption and what was behind that corruption of the whole earth, which I think is technology. And so they are in fairy legend. I'll talk about a Scottish legend here, although this is the same story that's repeated over around the world. And I do have this in my book if people were to look it up in my book. They have these very advanced flying machines that come through these portals that I was talking about earlier. And they kidnap people for a fortnight or for about 14 days. And they do sexual experiments on them, DNA experiments, and then they return them. And people tend not to have a good memory of it unless it comes out based on hypnosis and meditation and that sort of things. But the witnesses around it always know about the kidnapping and then the return of these people. And so when you look at the description of these fairies that are doing it, they're called, actually in Scotland, the grey neighbours. And again, you have this classification of this known as like a grey. And the description of that grey fairy is the same as a grey alien. And so when I look at some of these alien things, and I know there's a wider variety in the alien mythos than just the greys, but I look at this as kind of a direct connection to, if there are any that are surviving, to answer your question, I would say this would be the best place to start looking because of all of the reports and things that are going on these days in terms of aliens. Again, we don't have any solid evidence, but the world does seem to be moving for good or bad in a direction where you're going to have a revelation of these type of beings, that we're not alone in the universe. Over 50% of the people today believe that the aliens exist. I'm not convinced if this coming out party for the aliens actually happens, is we'll actually get the straight story and is necessarily good for humankind. But I think we're going to see something like this come about in terms of, sort of an apex, because everything's building to accepting and meeting and greeting with these galactic beings from around the universe.
Well, it definitely seems like out of all the entities that we've talked about so far, it certainly seems like there's a bigger push to promote the idea of aliens being real and the idea of aliens making themselves known to the world, just very blatantly and just very flamboyantly in front of people, and maybe something like landing on the White House lawn or something like that. But the next thing I wanted to bring up a little bit is the idea of chimeras and human technology that's kind of being developed today that's kind of causing the creation of chimeras. So, for example, we've heard about the reports or the stories, and they're not even necessarily even conspiracy reports or stories at all, in that we can clearly see them in labs today where you see mice with human ears on them. At least that's one that I've heard of. There's probably other human limbs that have been grown on animals. But a question that I've always kind of thought with that whole idea is, okay, so let's say, you have a mouse today that can grow a human ear, but let's say, 10 years from now, a monkey could partially grow a human brain. To what point then after that, obviously through the intervention of human technology and laboratory work that can happen. But the question I guess that I have today or thought is that at what point can an animal be mixed with human body parts? Does that animal then become a person, if that makes any sense?
So I think it makes perfect sense. And in terms of how it will have a complete redefining as to what humanity would be under those sort of circumstances. And the chimera comes out of Greek mythology, where it was a combination of a large number of beings, similar to sort of the description that these scorpion gods had, except they were more of a lion characteristic, but other significant characteristics mixed in. So the question gets to be is, okay, we're doing that today with the Chimera Project, and it's seemingly heading in the same direction. So is this how so many of these beings were created in prehistory and then a reflection of that technology, or was it actually the gods that did it? We don't know. We do know knowledge came from the gods. We do know that in so many records around, whether it's the Bible or other mythologies and religions, is that they actually did have sex with some humans to create the demigods. But in most of the religions and accountings for the the little people, the elementals, the different classifications, they seem to be a byproduct of sexual copulation, but all of them don't necessarily have that same sort of source. So I think this was something that we need to be aware of, because we're on the edge of being able to do all of that and more as our technology and knowledge is advancing at a pace that is just mind-boggling as to how much more knowledge and capability and technology is developing, and at an ever-increasing pace.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like with this technology, one thing that I've thought before about it is that it just seems like it's rapidly evolving so fast that, I mean, for example, if you take a look at, 1000 AD to 1500 AD, it seemed like the technological advances, although there were many, obviously, it didn't seem like they were as drastic as, let's say, 1500 to today, or even, you look back at, 1900 to today, the amount of technological advances that have occurred just seems so drastic that it makes you wonder if that there's been some kind of intervention that have helped people advance so much so fast.
Well, I think so. And just as we had the National Socialist movement, the Nazis of World War II, come out, with incredible advancements quickly. And what they said is they did talk to their pantheon of gods and their spirit guides and their celestial masters as part of the secret societies and the Ariosophy religion that they had, which is a evolution or perversion, depending on who you talk to, of Theosophy, which is Gnosticism as its creator in terms of that religion, or a branch out religion. And so I see such a ramp up of technology as we continue to move forward that it is like we're getting help with it, because I don't believe it's just the knowledge feeding on itself. It just seems to be, from where we're headed and going with it, is that it's being coached or guided. So if we are approaching the end days, which I think we are, so the listeners understand we're not in it, but we might be able to see it on the horizon with all of the signs. This is one of those signs that I think Jesus was talking about when he said it was going to be like the days of Noah. And what happened in the days of Noah is the Nephilim were created. And in the days of Noah,
I'm coming home, baby. With listings you may not find anywhere else, find your next home on Domain. I'm coming home, baby, now.
you had a merging of two banks of knowledge. You have the 7 sacred sciences, which are being developed throughout the first 6 generations or so of the people of Genesis. And then you have the illicit knowledge from heaven merging with the creation and the timing of the Nephilim with the seven sciences, and extrapolating that for the last 4 generations into a rapid advancement that corrupted the whole world. So I think when we look at that analogy of the days of Noah, I think that's what we're seeing today. And the analogy there it was additional knowledge by the gods or the fallen angels, depending on your perspective, that rapidly expanded this knowledge to create not only the chimeras and the scorpion gods and all these other creatures recorded in prehistory, but also caused the downfall of the antediluvian world, or the first apocalypse by water, just as this is going to be the apocalypse by fire.
Where does this all come out of?
Well, this comes out of, again, polytheism. So this is from the secret societies and the Gnostics. So, and it's recorded in the Polychronicon, and it's recorded in Albert Mackey's History of Freemasonry, and he's a great patriarch of the 1800s of Freemasonry. And so just to give a quick preface on this, and we see this as a related thing as it comes down in all the different legends around the world in just sort of different wording and stuff like that. So as it goes with the Freemasons is Adam was taught the 7 sciences, or the knowledge of God that he wanted Adam to have while he was still in Eden. And then after he leaves Eden and they produce Abel and Cain, Adam teaches this knowledge to both Abel and Cain. Abel's murdered, Cain leaves, and then later Seth is born. And what's important to understand that is there's two avenues of these 7 sciences as they're starting to develop. And from the Cain side, he has a son named Enoch, understanding there's 2 Enochs in biblical genealogies. One's the son of Cain and one is the son of Jared. The one son of Jared is the one that's taken to heaven. So we want to be careful not to confuse these two. And they both wrote scripture, as it seems, from various different sources. So when you're reading Enochian literature, you want to be aware of this. So Enoch puts this knowledge into 7 disciplines or sciences that we would know today as the 7 liberal sciences. So they're very much the same sciences that we are aware of today. And, they would be things like, grammar, rhetoric, dialectics, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, with the 5th science being what they call in the craft or Freemasonry, actually called Masonry as the 5th science. And so this is the knowledge that then is developed up to about the 6th generation, where then it partners with the illicit knowledge of the gods and or the fallen angels, as the book of Enoch, first book of Enoch, talks about. And it develops this knowledge to a whole level that just rapidly expands that knowledge. And the knowledge is sort of reflected biblically in what is going on in the Cain lineage. When we look at Jubal being listed as one of Lamech's descendants, and there's 2 Lamechs. Again, I'm still on the Cain lineage here, but there's a Lamech on the Jared lineage, as being responsible for inventing tents and ranching. You have Jubal also, who is credited with promoting Masonry, which is why he's a great patriarch of the Masons. You have Jubal, who's both in the Bible and Freemasonry accredited to creating the music. And you have Tubal-Cain, which most people are aware of. In the Bible, he forged tools and bronze and iron, and is thought to be the patriarch of the Cainites that somehow show up after the flood. And you also have him as the greatest artificer of Freemasonry, who created tools and weapons, and was a master craftsman and a master at military strategy, and as a great warrior, and is thought to be Tubal-Cain in their tradition in Freemasonry records. So again, what we have is a merging of all of these different things in terms of what do secret societies have to do with the end time, particularly when you understand that they take their beginnings, and this is their writings, this is what they say, this is not me necessarily believing it, but taking them from what they say, that their societies were created at the same time as mysticism, the sun-worshipping mysticism, and the giants were being procreated on the earth to protect this knowledge, to bring it down through the mystery schools throughout history.
Is this knowledge in and of itself inherently evil, or is it more neutral? What would you say about that?
Well, knowledge is neutral. Knowledge can be used for good or it could be used for evil. So it's not the knowledge that you have to worry about. It's what you do with that knowledge. And that's always, the second side of the blade. And typically the knowledge doesn't always get used for good. And so that's the issue. So what's guiding the development of the knowledge? And to what end? And that's where the debate should be on knowledge, not with whether or not knowledge is good or not. And are we ready to, and have the wisdom to, and the discipline to handle the development? And should it develop faster than our ability to do that?
Yeah, it just seems like with technological advances today, even in the fields of genetics, but also, even tech, it just seems like the advances are happening so fast, and I feel like legislators aren't really able to set what are the rules to play by beforehand, and it's more they act in a reactionary way in that they respond to what's happening, but they're not necessarily forward thinking or laying out what to actually do beforehand. So we see it right now even with the tech world, in that there's talks now about having antitrust legislation brought up against Google or Facebook or things like that, or companies like that. But it's very reactionary. It's not forward thinking. It's okay, well, these tech companies are so big now we have to respond to them. And it seems like the same thing is going to go on with genetics as well, and these ideas of, these chimeras or hybrids or things like that will be made in the future, even cloning, where, it just seems like all the legislation now is just going to be reactionary, and it's not very, like, oh, we should do this beforehand.
The Australian Ballet presents Don Quixote, a wildly colourful stage spectacle bursting with humour.
Well, developing things as you go is no way to deal with it, because you're developing it after the fact, right? And you never really catch up on it. So we don't know, in terms of these beings that would be created, is will they even have a conscience of any form, right? Will they be absolutely amoral? Or will they be psychopathic? Will it be good? Will they not be? I mean, we have no idea, and we have no idea what we want them to do, and we have no idea where we want them to fit into society, but yet we want to jump forward into that until we have had that proper debate and a proper resolution to the definition of what they are, who they are, where they fit, how we're going to manage this. And I just think we're moving so far ahead of our understanding and wisdom at this point that, to me, it becomes frightening, because we have no idea what the consequences are going to be.
No, I think you're completely right, Gary. The next question I kind of want to ask you a little bit about, and you alluded to it again in our last interview, was the idea of dinosaurs, kind of, where they came from a little bit, and the distinction between dinosaurs and dragons, because I feel like most people in our contemporary world, they view dragons as these mythical entities that breathe fire and have wings and guard caves with gold. And I think most people view dinosaurs as these very real world animals that existed hundreds of millions of years ago. But I just figured that I'd ask you to kind of talk about that a little bit, maybe reconcile the difference between these, dinosaurs and dragons, if you would, a little bit.
Yeah. So, one of the big questions too is when did dinosaurs exist? We have the scientific perspective in terms of their types of datings that take them to be very old. Is that accurate, or is that not accurate? Do they fit in, before the time of the flood and the time of creation as we have in Genesis, or did they exist before that? And then who created them? How were they created? And why do they have this sort of reptilian sort of look? And it's such a deep sort of subject, but I'll briefly do a quick scan over it, is that we don't know from a Christian perspective that the earth is only 6,000 years old. What we do have is that we have a lineage that goes back to Adam. But is Adam even the first creation? Because the Eden account is so diametrically different than the day 6 account, they really can't be the same creation. So do we have a bit of a gap there between day 6 and the creation of Adam after day 6 and then into day 7 or day 8. And then you have this idea that is Genesis 1:1-2 translated properly. And I have handouts for this if people want to get a hold of me through my Genesis 6 Conspiracy website and ask for this information or anything that I'm talking about that I have handouts on. I'll email it to you. Is that you can translate Genesis 1:1-2 as two different ways. The standard theology is that, right in Genesis 1 right through Genesis 7 or day 7 is 7 days, however long a day is, and whether it's 1,000 years or not, that doesn't give you enough of a gap to match that up with scientific accounting for. But you can also translate Genesis 1:1-2 after the heavens and the earth are originally created, that it became void. And when you take it back to Hebrew, you can very much make a case for that actually the earth became void. And so if the earth became void and then it was renewed, as it talks about by the Holy Spirit in Psalms 104:3 or 30, I'm sorry, then you have the accounting for why the Spirit is hovering over the earth as day one is about to begin, because this is a renewal of the earth. So then the question would be, when was the earth destroyed? We know then, therefore, if it was destroyed, that it was just renewed starting with day one. But you have this age where it seems to me it fits better to have the angelic rebellion fit into. This is not constitutional for me from a Christian perspective, but it tends to fit better than trying to squeeze everything into the accountings of day 1 through day 7. And when we look at,
He lied about his age to enlist. He was wounded at Lone Pine while saving a mate.
these rebellious angels, and then we look at the leader of these angels, they're called watchers in Enoch. And these watchers also show up in Daniel 4. So we know that there's a consistency to the language between Enoch and the Bible, even though First Enoch may not be 100% uncorrupted. But when we look at these angels that are showing up in Genesis 6 as the sons of God, these are the seraphim angels. And the seraphim angels show up in Isaiah 6, and they're 6-winged angels. And you take seraphim back to Hebrew, and that's seraph. And seraph means fiery serpent angel. So a reptilian face to it. And what's important to understand about that is as you put wings on this snake-like being, and you have a heavenly dragon. And these are the beings that are thought to have procreated in Genesis 6 to create the Nephilim, which is why you have descriptions of these offspring demigods and kings afterwards looking like serpents, because they look like they're procreators. And then you have the Nakash incident in Eden. Nakash is the Hebrew word for serpent. And everybody looks at the serpent as being this creature as we know it as today, as being slimy, crawling on the ground. But before the Eden incident, in terms of causing the fall of humankind by either being avatared or
Hey, bud. Good to see ya.
And I use the Hindu term avatar because it best describes that it's more of a symbiotic relationship between the angelic spirit and the human or the animal, as Satan also entered into Judas in terms of when he betrayed Jesus, as another example of this to bring down the fall of humans. And what's important about this is that this being before the fall is described as the craftiest or most intelligent being that's out there. It walks, it talks, and it deceives Eve, who then brings in Adam on the deception. And so you have this being that is a serpent-like being, also being around at the time of Adam and Eve. And then if you project that in this species, there could be multiple kinds of this type of being. It would not be too hard to understand that you now have a serpent with wings as opposed to just arms. So there could have been several different kinds of these things within the species. And if that's the case, and I know that's speculation, then you have an accounting for this flying dragon. Now, what's interesting about that is it is in the polytheist and legends that was the rebellious angels and Satan, who is also described as a serpent and a dragon, favorite animal of that time, not out of the Bible, but out of other accounts, particularly in the Gnostic religions. And so then we take that back to the dinosaur question, and I'm trying to do bunch of connecting of dots here, so hopefully I'm not losing anybody, and you have all of these reptilian beings. So it was the time before the renewal of the earth, the time when the earth was overrun by these dinosaurs, which were called dragons up to the 1600s, and then changed to dinosaurs as you have the Royal Society and the development of the 7 liberal arts into the modern age of science. Another rabbit hole I won't go into, but deeply connected to what we were talking about earlier on the seven sacred sciences. So now they're called dinosaurs, but before they were called dragons. And so they're these reptilian beings. And so were these the beings that the seraphim angels created on earth before the rebellion and were destroyed as part of the rebellion, and all taking place between Genesis 1:1 to 1:2, although I do leave possibility that all that could happen between days 1 and 7.
So then, are you suggesting then that there may have been 3 destructions, 2 that have already happened and one's to come, being the first one being the one with the dinosaurs, then the one with the flood, and now we're headed towards the third one with fire in the book of Revelation?
So when you get into Genesis 1, verses between 1 and 2, you get into the words formless and void. So yes, you're talking about a third destruction that we're talking about for end time prophecy. And formless and void come from boohu and tuhu in Hebrew, which is sort of an active verb about becoming that way. And then when you get into Isaiah 45, and God talks about God not creating anything out of vain and to be lived in. So why would he create the world as being void? He would create it all at once because he's omnipotent. So yeah, what I'm laying out is a possibility that you have 3 destructions, with the third one somewhere down the road. Could be on the horizon, but I don't set dates on making those kinds of predictions.
That's a good point. It seems like to me something that I think about, and I think a lot of other people think about this too, about the dinosaur world, quote unquote, is that it seems so distant and so far removed from the world as we know it today. So, I mean, I think when people think back to the past and they think, okay, a woolly mammoth, I think that they can look at that and say, okay, well, the living descendant of that today is an elephant. Yeah. Or, the saber-tooth tiger, for example, they look at that and say, okay, the modern day descendant of that is a tiger or a lion. And it seems like because of those bridges that ancient animal doesn't seem so far removed or so alien. But yeah, when you look at dinosaurs, for example, they seem so distant because there's no real world things like it today. I mean, most of the time, we think about, dinosaur things like that today. I mean, you're thinking what, like a little lizard or maybe a crocodile or an alligator. But even that really, I mean, there's nothing similar to the Tyrannosaurus Rex, for example, in regards to, how it looks, how it operates and things like that, or, the long neck dinosaur. You don't really see any real world examples of that today. So I feel like because of that, it just makes the dinosaur world seem so far away or just so foreign to anything that we experience in this world right now.
Yeah, but there are connections there between those ones and similar type of ones in a dinosaur size, right? That would have been recorded in prehistory, as you mentioned, with the tiger. Same with the crocodiles. So there's some room there, but but from the basis of the point that you're making, I agree with that. It just seems to be like a world away from being part of our shorter term history and our recent history. So it's hard to see how that connections are. And it's also interesting to see how science is now moving towards.
Since the dawn of time, humanity has sought to perfect the party. The scientist that Jackbox gave.
The idea that most of these, or a lot of these dinosaurs, had feathers as opposed to just being, our typical sort of hard-skinned or slimy reptilian sort of version is what would come to mind for most people. And I find that rather illuminating to the fact that I think that's an important connection to the idea of who the seraphim angels were when we talked about them as, having wings and an opalescent being, and in the physical world as a, 6-winged angel. And so they were presumably, and how we like to depict them is with feathers. And then we have what we call the plume serpents and the I'm trying to think the feathered serpents out of Central America, whether it's through the Incas or through it's the Quiché Maya or the Aztecs, and even into the thunderbirds, into native North American understanding. And you have this idea of this flying serpent reptile, creator gods, as they like to, or at least of civilizations and things, as they like to look at themselves. Through the histories of the legends and the different religions around the world. And one wonders whether or not that's what they had originally created in that first world, if that is actually what happened between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, that they created a world after their own image. You know, we don't get an understanding that the serpent out of Eden and whatever was else involved in terms of the variety of the species, any of them were saved, but maybe they were. And we get this alien mythos where you have reptilians as one of the more powerful type of aliens in that mythos. And again, you wonder, was there some that were saved and remained, or were they recreated after the flood again? And if those ones were, then what happened to them? And did those angels go back to who did that, go to the abyss as well for violating the laws of creation? So you have this sort of reptilian sort of understanding with of that in the alien mythos. You have that with the Nakash, and then you have that with the offspring of the angels in Genesis 6, and as they're described around the worlds, or the Nagas out of subcontinent of India, and on and on and on and on, and in all continents around the world. There was this idea of these serpent people. And then we get a couple of interesting prophecies that show up in the Bible. And the first one begins in Genesis 3:15. And that talks about after Adam and Eve have been banned from Eden for eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that there's a prophecy of what they call the serpent seed, where the offspring of the serpent will be at odds with the offspring of the woman ongoing. And so is that an allegory, or is that an actual type of race? And so the only evidence we get for that race as being ongoing would be coming out of Genesis 6. And again, these serpent-like Nephilim beings also survived the flood because they show up after the flood. So if there is a fulfillment of that as an ongoing war or push between serpent or reptilian beings, that's where you would start to look. And then when you get into Isaiah 14:29, it also talks about the serpent root that is going to produce a cockatrice, which is an adder or a venomous type of snake, and the flying serpent, which is a seraphim, and actually goes back to seraph as you take that back to Hebrew. And this is a prophecy of the end time when the Assyrian or the Antichrist is on the scene and is destroying Babylon. And Isaiah 14 is also the accounting of Satan, or Hail El, as it's known in 14:12 of Isaiah, as you take that back to Hebrew. And you have this whole concept of this brewing of this serpent type of reptilian adversary, spiritual through the fallen angel watchers who rebelled, including Satan, who seems to be both seraphim and cherubim, as he's described in Revelation 12, and as a cherubim that walks amongst the fiery stones in Ezekiel 28, which the seraphim do as they're described in Isaiah 6, whereas cherubim are just covering angels over the throne. And so he seems to be that powerful before his fall. And you have that serpent imagery being all wrapped into Isaiah 14 and Isaiah 13, which is part of the same prophecy. We do know he's degraded from Hail El to Satan.
Wow, that's terrible. I can't believe that.
Status, which is adversary, right? It's a title as opposed to a name, a position, as you define that back into the Hebrew language. And so he is degraded because he is no longer as powerful as he is, and which is why angels like Michael will be able to deal with him in the end time. So I think he is degraded. And does that mean he loses, is degraded to look like a serpent or a dragon, or he had that look as well? It's also being seraphim and cherubim before. So it's hard to know. But what we do know is he is degraded in status to adversary.
Wow, Gary, those are some very interesting topics that you mentioned, and yeah, just even throughout this whole interview today, you've brought up some very interesting topics, and I'd certainly love to have you come back on again, and we could talk about more things in the future. But yeah, I also wanted to thank you for coming on today. I want to thank you for your time. And before we go, would you mind, telling us how we can follow you online? How can we read the literature that you're producing, and how can we follow any kind of commentaries that you're producing?
Sure. So, and again, I put out one of these commentaries every week to weekend and a half. So, and they're all very detailed as I get sort of into more of the details and behind it, because it's, there's so much information on this that you can't really get it all out without losing people. So people who are really wanting to get into the detail, you can follow me on Facebook. Under Gary Wayne. I have 2 Genesis 6 conspiracy pages there. I also have a Facebook group called Gary Wayne and the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and I post all of my commentaries and many of my interviews into those places as well. So, and you can also, as I do the commentary, I'm linked on my social media into Twitter, so that goes out. My interviews and my commentaries go out on Twitter at GaryWayne63, at GaryWayne63. You can also contact me and get a good feel for my book.
What was that one? Did you say his email address?
Goes out. My interviews and my commentaries go out on Twitter at GaryWayne63, at GaryWayne63.
Twitter.
You can also contact me and get a good feel for my book if you're interested at my website, which is the Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6 with the number 6 conspiracy.com. And there's an email there. You can connect through to my Facebook pages and or Twitter pages from there as well if you want to go that way. And you can email me with questions, or if you want any of these commentaries sent to you, I can give you the Facebook commentary link, or I can give you the Word document. So if there's a subject that I talked about that interested you, I'd likely have a commentary on that I can send you.
Well, great, Gary. Yeah, like I said, we'd love to have you come back on again.
Oh, terrific. I'd love to come back.
Okay, guys, I'll finish with, I think it's Carl Gallup's. Hang on. Yeah, Carl Gallup's Threat of Prophetic Apocalyptic Aliens.
To that, I spent 10 years, a little over 10 years, in Florida law enforcement officer, as a Florida law enforcement officer. The bulk of that 10 or 11 years was spent in 2 different sheriff's offices under 3 different sheriffs, patrol officer, criminal investigations, etc. So a lot of life experience. But in my experience in the ministry, I've done a lot of preaching and teaching, particularly on this topic we're going to discuss today. And I've written a lot to it in books published by major Christian publishers, one of them in my most favorite, Defender Publishing, and several books and a lot of research. And again, that doesn't make me the expert of all experts, but I do know what I'm talking about biblically. And I'm not pulling what I'm going to say, I'm not pulling it out of my back pocket. It comes from making scriptural connections and as well as scientific connections. So that's kind of my background into all of this. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So leaving aside the UFO and alien abduction phenomena for the moment and just looking at the question, could life exist on other planets? Is there anything in the Bible that would preclude the possibility that there might be life somewhere on other planets?
Yeah. The way you've asked it, is there anything in the Bible that could preclude the possibility? My answer is no. There's not, in my opinion. And I think I even quote Dr. Michael Heiser and several others who are more learned than I am, who have come to the same conclusion, and that is this. Look, I think the Bible is earth and humanity central, because that's probably the center of God's heart and his whole plan for the universe. But and there doesn't seem to be a mention in the scriptures of what we would think of as human life on another planet that needs to be redeemed, and Jesus had to go to different planets and die on a cross and rise from the dead. There doesn't seem to be anything that says that. But in the broader scope of the thing, you and I both know, because this is a great thrill of scripture to you and I both, and that is, we know that there are, I mean, scientifically speaking, multiverses, multiple dimensions. And the Bible tells us that. I mean, it tells us there's heaven, there's hell, there's paradise, there's the eternity, there's the chasm between paradise and prison, the holding place for the, I mean, and all of these things are just said. And we see angels coming and going from different dimensions. I mean, when Abraham said he looked up and saw 3 men coming, well, then we find out later it's the angels and the Lord himself. Well, so the question is, where'd they come from? Did they live up in the mountains? I mean, does God secretly live in a cave somewhere and he just comes down every now and then and shows us himself? Or did he drop down out of the sky? Or did Abraham see a UFO land and they all got out? No, they're walking through portals. They're coming through dimensions. And now with the study of quantum mechanics and quantum physics and quantum science, we understand that this is so. Now, having said all of that, that then leaves open the possibility that God has done other things in other dimensions. That's none of our business right now. And so I am not going to say, as Dr. Heiser would say, I'm not going to say what God can't do or hasn't done. So anyway, if you just go strictly by the scriptures and that's all you knew, and if you didn't know anything about multi-dimensions of reality other than what the Bible said, we might be able to make a hardcore statement and say, no, there's nothing else besides us. But that's, I'm not prepared to say that. And I think if we discovered human-like life on other planets, I mean, physically and literally, I'm not talking about demonic deception and all that. We're going to get to that. But if we discovered that somehow and God allowed us to, or even if we get to glory and the Lord says, now let me show you what all I've done all over the place and all through all the dimensions, it wouldn't surprise me at all, because is God able to do that? Yes. But anyway, that's a long answer to a short question, but I know that's a lot of people ask that question, so I wanted to be thorough.
Oh, that's a great answer. Yeah, definitely. So talking about the alien abduction phenomena, what do you make of that? Is this demon attacks? Is this hallucinations? Are these actual aliens abducting people? What do you make of the whole alien abduction phenomena?
Okay. Yes, and no. I think some of it's delusion. I mean, it just has to be. I mean, humans are very complex, and we're in a fallen world. And out of the billions and billions of us, bless their hearts, there are people that are delusional. And and other people seeking some kind of attention, and other people that are on drugs, and we know that. So leave that category out. When we get down to the double or triple handfuls of what seem to be real brain twisters, like all the tests you can run on these people have been run, and they seem to be sane and rational people, and they take lie detector tests, and they're put under hypnosis, and they keep coming up with the same stories. That gets a little freakier to people. So let's just pretend like, for the sake of this conversation, that those are absolutely real and that experience actually happened to these people. So then what's the explanation? And I think, and we'll get into this much deeper, I think it's demonic. I truly do not think it's actual physical humanoid type beings from other planets that have developed the technology and the curiosity to be so far more advanced than we are, to come to us for the sole purpose of trashing the gospel of Jesus Christ and examining us sexually and messing with our minds and terrifying us. I can't even imagine that a culture that advanced that would be what they're up to. See, that sounds more like demonic activity. But anyway, so that's my answer. I think some of these experiences are real. Look, it's like people that get involved, they get sucked into the occult or witchcraft or seances, and they come out of them scared to death saying, I promise you, I saw an entity, a being, and it was my great-great-granddaddy, and I know, and I saw, well, but the Bible has an answer for that. You're watching demons posing, they're posers. They're mimicking, they're masquerading. Even Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. In fact, I discussed this in one of my books I've written with Defender called Masquerade. So I think some of these experiences have proven to be as real as we can measure them to be real. But what does that mean? And what I'm saying is, I think more than likely, biblically speaking, and even scientifically speaking now, more than likely, we are dealing with interdimensional experiences of some kind of an entity, and I would say an evil entity, and I would say that would be demonic. You see, the Bible, people ask me all the time, do I believe there's other life out there in the universe? My answer is absolutely, and people freak out. Really? You're a preacher. You believe in aliens and little green men from other planets? And I say, well, you didn't ask me that. You asked me if I believe in life out there in the universe. The Bible tells us there's the angelic realm, there's the demonic realm, there's power behind it. Satan is called the prince of the power of the air. There's technology behind it. Again, prince of the power of the air. And in the last days, all kinds of signs and wonders, and fire will be called down from the heavens, and there will be signs in the heavens. Something's going to happen. Jesus said people will faint with, well, that's the King James. They will die with heart attacks when they see the terror that's coming upon the earth. That even the elect could be deceived in the last days. See, there's some kind of terrible, terror-invoking deception that is demonic. The Bible says that's coming in the last days. I think those kinds of verses, studied in their context, probably may point to some type of a UFO disclosure. Somehow this UFO phenomena, I believe, has to be involved in the last days deception, because it's so ubiquitous throughout ancient history, right up to modern day times. Our military's talking about it now. Our government's talking about it. Other militaries and other governments in the world are talking about it, revealing videos now in this age of video technology wonder. And how could it not be?
Even if you can't be there, Southern Phone keeps you connected with loved ones.
I mean, if it's not humanoid beings from other planets, then it's demonic. And a lot of ufologists who have spent decades believing that it was humanoid beings from other planets have now backed way off of that, and they've gone on public record, as you know, saying, no, after all these years, we believe these are entities that have always been among us, always been here, probably interdimensional. They are probably malevolent. They have nothing good designed, and several of them, who I don't think are even believers, from after I'm reading their biographies, say this phenomena we now believe is more in line with what the Christians would call demonic activity. So I think that's what we're dealing with, brother. I mean, again, I only know what I know, and everything I know that the Scripture says and what modern science says, and then these people that have devoted their lives to studying this matter have said recently in writing and on film. I think we're dealing with interdimensional entities that mean no good to us, and the Bible would describe that as demonic activity.
Yeah, definitely. I can totally see how this is, whatever's going on, it's definitely harmful for humans. Speaking of which, do you believe, some people talk about an alien breeding program. Do you see anything about that in the Bible? Do you believe that accounts of that are true, or is this something else that may have been misinterpreted?
Yes and no. Now, I'm going to define that so you don't think I'm walking the fence. But no, I don't see anything in the Bible that in those words, black and white, speaks of that in the last days. However, there is a huge connection, and this gets a little complex, but I'm going to make it simple. I've spoken to it in several of my books in great detail, referencing scholars and scientists. So again, all of us scholars and scientists and authors can be wrong. So I'm not saying that just because I have a lot of references behind me that I'm 100% right. But I'm saying to your audience here and to the viewers that I'm not pulling this out of my back pocket.
Diane, I couldn't believe it when I clicked on vast links and seen them crawling around with their lasers. I couldn't believe it.
Okay. So, no, the Bible doesn't say in the last days there will be aliens that will be breeding with humans. But here's what Jesus said about the last days. It will be just like the days of Noah and just like the days of Lot. In Luke 17, he includes both of those. In Matthew 24, he says like the days of Noah, and he punctuates both of them. And both times, Luke 17 and Matthew 24, he's speaking to totally different audiences, 4 or 5 months apart in different locations of the Roman Empire. So this was a big deal. I mean, Jesus gave us a huge clue about almost not a timeline, but a graphic kind of chronology of the kinds of things that would happen and about when they would happen. Say, Carl, how can you know that? Because Jesus said it would be sort of like, kind of like Noah. No, he didn't say that. He said it'll be a metaphor of it will be Noah.
Actually, you're right, Bart. It's very disgusting, but I couldn't help it. That image just made me laugh. But yeah, how wicked is it? Yeah, you're right. I just didn't expect to see that when I locked onto your link.
No, he didn't say that. He said it will be just like the days of Noah. Now, in reference to your question, so we go back and we read about the days of Noah, and I don't just go to chapter 6 through 11 of Genesis, because Noah's mentioned in several more places in the Old Testament. He's mentioned throughout the New Testament. He's mentioned in Matthew 24, he's mentioned in Luke 17, and he's mentioned in several other places in the gospel. He's also mentioned by Peter. He's mentioned by the writer of Hebrews. So when you pull it all together, we start with that scary little verse in Genesis 6 that said, and in those days, what days? The days of Noah. The sons of God came unto the daughters of men. Now, this could be a 4-hour teaching, and I've written several books. Dr. Michael Heiser is the king of all of this. He's written several books, The Unseen Realm being, I guess, his masterpiece on this. But that term, as most of your audience probably will know, it comes from the Hebrew phrase, B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. And that specific phrase is only used 5 or 6 times in the Old Testament. There are other phrases that are similar to it. And in English, when you're trying to translate from ancient Hebrew, sometimes the translations aren't that great. But every time that exact phrase is used, it is interpreted in every English translation as divine beings or angels, except in Genesis 6, where that same phrase is used, but almost every scholarly translation translates it literally. When the sons of God, they don't say when the angels from another realm came unto the daughter of men, or when divine beings entered in through a wormhole from another realm and came unto it just says the sons of God. Because what it is, it's so freaky to our mind, because then now it involves potential sexual involvement, and there would go to the breeding thing. Or to the very least, I write in my research of this, at the very least, I think it means that there was something, I'm just going to use this word, it's a modern word, something technological going on. There was some, well, what do we find in the UFO captivity phenomena? They say, well, I was probed and prodded and my sexual organs were examined and and they spooked up into me, and examined the womb and the uterus.
And Bas, that was the first attack on a Christian school because they're Christian. So things are really ramping up now.
The birth canal, and I mean, you'll hear these things, and so I can kind of envision that Satan and the demonic realm that was in the process of this whole fallen creation since the garden, there was something about the birth process and the womb and the ability that humans have to create themselves that God gave to us. like a Xerox machine. We can just we can zoom off copies of ourselves, and so there was some kind of curiosity, maybe even some kind of ability. People say, well, angels can't have sex with humans. Well, actually, the Bible doesn't clearly say that, either in the Hebrew or the Greek. Some will refer to Jesus where it says, well, in heaven they're neither given or taken in marriage like they are. But that says nothing about reproduction. It really doesn't. He's just talking about the institution of marriage as we know it and the necessity for marriage as we know it.
Okay, that's a good point.
In a world that's perfect and not fallen, none of that will be a necessity, is what Jesus is saying. He's telling the Pharisees, you're thinking of it all wrong. You're thinking of it strictly earthly. But when we are in glory, it's not just another form of earth. It's a glorified everything. No more sin, no more death, no more pain, no more death, all these things. So when we get back to the Genesis account, we run into this thing that was either one of two things by the wording there. It says, because then they came unto them and had children by them.
Yeah.
Well, in the most normal use of the Hebrew language and the English language, that would mean like we know it in our mind of producing children. But could it have been technological? I mean, we think we invented test tube babies and CRISPR-Cas9 technologies and and genetic editing. I don't think that the demonic realm has ever looked at these kinds of things and said, gee, we didn't know that could be done. I can't believe these humans figured something like that. No, I think this knowledge has been around since the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's good things from CRISPR-Cas9 and genetic editing and mRNA research, but there's evil that can be attached to it as well. And you remember what was Satan's temptation to Adam and Eve? You can be like us who, the angelic realm, the sons of God. You can be like us. In what some translations says, you can be like God, and that's because the word Elohim, it could be either the multiplicity of the angelic realm or God himself, the creator of all, and it just depends upon the context. But in either way, Satan is saying, you can know all the stuff we know, all the stuff about creation and everything, if you will sit down at my feet and let me eat of the fruit I will bring to you. So it's got to be, Josh, and then we get to Peter and Jude in the New Testament, and we read very clearly about some class of divine beings that are now being held in the deepest dungeons of the prison of Hades, hell, prison, waiting for the great judgment of the last days. And both of those cases in Jude and Peter, it extrapolates back with imagery of the days of Noah and the flood and Sodom and Gomorrah kind of activity. It says that. So that seems to connect directly with that thing that happened in the days of Noah in Genesis 6. So the point is, I told you this was complex, but I don't, I could just say yes or no to your question and we move on, and then people would be divided and freaked out. So I'm trying to give some contextual foundation, scientific and biblical. So I know that the concept of alien human breeding is huge.
Hey, not good to see you, mate.
And some would have us to believe that about half of the 8 billion people on the planet are hybrids. And that may be, but you hear Jesus say it's going to be just like the days of Noah. So what does that mean? It means it almost has to mean, in my humble opinion, I could be wrong, but it almost has to mean that either there is some kind of literal, physical, in the last days, some of that demonic presence is going to be released. And you read in the book of Revelation about the chasm coming open and the demonic powers coming out. You read about the demonic that lead the kings of the earth astray. I mean, that's in the book of Revelation. You hear Paul talk about in the last days, doctrines of demons will flood the earth. And that word doctrine doesn't just apply to biblical teaching. It applies to teaching of facts and truth and knowledge. So facts and truth and knowledge of demons will flood the earth in the last days. So it's got to mean, when Jesus said it'll be just like, and those are his words, not my words. Just like means just like. It's got to mean that Genesis 6 is included. which has got to mean one of two things, in my opinion. Either there's some kind of demonic outpouring wherein these angels that have been held in captivity, can all the angelic realm procreate with humans if that was ever possible in the beginning? The Bible doesn't tell us. But if they could, and if that's what Peter and Jude are talking about, there was at least a class that could. There was some type. So there's either going to be that happening again in the last days, because Jesus said it'd be just like, or it will be attached to some kind of technology wherein, watch this, all flesh becomes corrupted again. That's what happened in Noah's day. And brother, we're the first generation since the days of Noah to see it happening again right before our eyes. mRNA technology has the ability to deliver complete corruption of flesh. In fact, the chief medical officer of Moderna, he's on a TED Talks video as we speak. I heard him say, we are rewriting the code of life. We are feeding new information. Your genome is like...
Okay, Vas, that's a good take on it. Yeah.
An operating system. He means like a computer. We're feeding it lines of code. We're switching off switches and switching on to other switches. It's astounding. And this has only happened in the last 10 years, that. And then prior to that, CRISPR-Cas9, the ability to cut and snip biologically the genome and recreate things, and using that to grow human livers inside of a pig, they think, and things like that. Brother, that's what Jesus said. So alien and human breeding, maybe, and if that's interpretation is proper from Genesis 6 and Peter and Jude, and that somehow that happened and God said, you...
On National Greyhound Adoption Day, will you help us find a forever home?
That you've stepped way over the line. And he put them until the last days. That seems to be the inference. And then in the last days there's an outpouring. Well, then that could happen, I guess. Now, there are people that I know that I think probably came from aliens. I'm being funny. I mean, listen, the human race is amazing, because there's all colors, there's all shapes and sizes, yet you cut us open and we're human. We're human, But so it would be easy if this has happened.
Vas, it was your fault because of the joke you just done. You encouraged me.
For the demonic to hide that within 8 billion people all over the planet. And there's still places on our planet where really no human foot has ever set foot. Oh, now we have satellites, and but still we haven't gotten down and put our feet on the soil. And many, 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 many millions of miles of territory all over the surface of this globe. It would be fairly easy for the demonic to hide that kind of process, if that's what's happening. But I say this, regardless, I mean, there may be people listening saying, oh, you're both nuts. That's crazy. That's just pure science fiction. Well, just remember, almost everything we're living with today was pure science fiction 20 years ago. The internet included, cell phones and CRISPR-Cas9 and mRNA and everything. It was all science fiction just 20, 25 years ago. But it's not now. We're living it. So I would be careful to dismiss it as just pure science fiction simply because your mind wants to shut down on it. And I would say that at the very least, though, there's some kind of demonic infusion of technological knowledge in the last days that's going to do some corrupting of flesh, animal and human. And when you think about this, my friend, when I draw people's attention to this, it usually snaps something in their brain. A light bulb comes on. Think of when God leveled his curses upon Adam and Eve and Satan. He leveled a curse upon Eve and the birthing process. And Satan's curse was pretty close to it. He said, your curse is, from the womb of a woman, the birthing process, will come a seed, a child. God's saying, I'm going to use a child to defeat your kingdom. and he's going to come from the womb of a woman, and it's going to be directed by heaven's throne, and he will crush your head. And I want to add these words.
Gee, he puts it great, doesn't he? I like Carl Gallitz. He really lays it out really well.
The same kind of junk you were trying to pervert, I'm going to use it to destroy you. I mean, that's what I see. Now, again, that's just my speculation. That's not the word of God. But everything I said prior to my speculation is in the word of God. So I think it all goes to the question you asked. I'm sorry I took so long to answer it, but this is one of those questions that's near and dear to me. People ask me all the time. And to me, it demands a little bit of biblical foundation and scientific foundation to wrap people's heads around it.
So in your opinion, what exactly are UFOs?
Okay. Well, science has spoken to this. You've asked my opinion, but science has spoken. And of course, you can take UFO only means, as you know, and your audience knows, something that's flying in the air that's
Okay, this is 11 months old, so they probably know about disclosure. Let's see.
Identifiable at the moment. Well, there's been a lot of explanations, and some of those explanations have turned out to be true. It's military aircraft, it's technology that's being worked on, it's just something you thought you saw that you didn't. Maybe it was just a jet airplane, the sun caught it just right and kind of eliminated the wings, and it looked like a sliver going through the air, and that was actually an airliner, swamp gas and all this stuff. And believe it or not, some of that has panned out that that's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
But we're still left with what a lot of experts now call are UFOs, residual UFOs, meaning all of that's left over from everything we've been able to explain and verify. Not just explain away, but explain. Okay. So now we're left with the residuals. Well, we can talk about examples in our lifetime as we're doing the show. Residual UFOs are those that the U.S. Navy can't figure out, and they've got them on video. Okay, that's residual. Why? Well, because the number one superpower in the world, with arguably the best technology in the world, there are a few others that have technology approaching ours, but there's still a lot of it they've stolen from us, China and Russia, and they could have some more advanced stuff than we do, but the most technologically advanced society that the planet has ever seen looks at these things. They try to track them, they try to chase them, they try to keep up with them. Not only can they not, but they're being described as objects of flight. They don't know what they are, so those are UFOs that are defying the laws of earthly physics. Now, scientists describe it that way. Pilots, Air Force pilots, Navy pilots describe it that way. Ufologists are describing it that way. Experts in physics and scientists are.
I just tried to look on YouTube, universe sand. It's black sand, and it looks like the universe. It's got it looks like the universe. It's got stars, different colored stars and that, and it looks like the universe. I can't find it though. It's really crazy how it looks.
Looking at this stuff, and they're saying there's nothing on earth that can do that. Yet there it is. You can see it. You can hear the guys live talking over their radios, freaking out. I mean, people say, well, it was all staged. Well, that's pretty elaborate staging, and I guess it could have been. But just take it at face value. When you pull all this stuff together, those are what we would refer to as UFOs. That is, are UFOs. Residual. That's not swamp gas. It's not an airliner with the sun shining on it at an angle, and is documented. And I don't think I'm stretching this by saying thousands of hours of this documentation over the last several decades. This has been going on, which also precludes it from being, or excludes, from being just simple, some kind of technology we're working on. People thought that, well, that's DARPA stuff. We're just not allowed to know. Well, DARPA's got some stuff that, we're not allowed to know. But the problem is these kinds of videos and or sightings have been going.
Your broken chair leg, our gorilla wood glue. For the toughest jobs on planet Earth.
Going on from military personnel for decades. And we didn't have anything that even approached that technology decades ago. Nobody on the planet did. Now, even decades later in our time,
No,
we
I can't
still
find
don't
it.
have anything that approaches it, even though we could envision that maybe DARPA or something like that is getting close to something like this. But I mean, we're talking about spacecraft they saw, or craft, unidentified craft they saw that was just zipping along near the surface of the ocean, and then instantly went straight up, be out of the atmosphere, and then back down, then went under the water in some cases, and then reemerged, and all at the speed of whatever, I don't know, they couldn't keep up with it. They said it was unearthly, it was inhuman, but yet it was obviously guided by intelligence. So that's what UFO means. And that's the kind of stuff we're interested in. Where is that coming from? What intelligence is behind it? Is it really beings from other planets that are so technologically advanced that they're down here showing off? Speaking of which, and it goes straight to your question again, but a lot of these ufologists that I have documented in my books, pointing behind me because they're on the shelf behind me, I have documented in my books, have actually and literally said that now they've come to the conclusion these are not humanoid kind of beings from other planets that are just more advanced than we are. These are interdimensional entities, they call them. And several of them have said, and they're showing off. They want us to see them. They want us to know, and this sounds like a horror movie, they're here. And I think this ties into the last days. We'll talk about that more in a moment in prophecy. I truly do. And I think the scripture speaks to it metaphorically, giving us foreshadowing of this kind of thing. It could be wrong, but we'll talk about that. But so anyway, that's what we're talking about when we say UFOs, and that phenomena is real. It's captured on film now by credible people, with many other credible people, scientists, etc., looking at it, people that deal in technology, and they're bumfuzzled by it from all the reports that have been released to us.
Yeah, speaking of these films and things that keep getting released, is there actual, I mean, I guess that would count as physical evidence because it's a video, and, of course, videos can be faked or, whatever, there's always that. But is there physical evidence to show that there is something physical going on here? And if so, what do we say to Christians or to anybody who says, well, there's no physical evidence to this phenomenon whatsoever?
That's just an untrue statement. Yes, there is physical evidence. And as you said, the videos, huge physical evidence, eyewitness from multiplicity of pilots seeing and tracking it at the same time, recording it. But as you said, I wrote about this in Masquerade, I believe, and I quoted Dr. Michael Heiser, and he quotes others and has a whole resource, and I used all of those and kind of conglomerated them together and put them in my book to quickly answer that question, because it's a good question and people ask that. But the answer is a resounding yes, there is physical evidence. It's been collected down through the years. Or somebody would say a spacecraft landed somewhere, and then they would go back and check, and sure enough, there was burnt up grass and or whatever radioactive material in the ground, and and these kinds of things are recorded. Now, and people would say, well, the demonic can't do that. What do you mean can't? The demonic can do anything that has to do with technology. The demonic can't create something out of nothing like God can. They can't create life out of nothing. They can manipulate.
Actually, Vars, funny you bring that up. Some of our rivers are clogged up with millions of dead fish. There's millions of dead fish in our rivers, and they're being clogged up.
What's already there, like we can. We can take a genome here and a genome there and do some CRISPR-Cas9. But where did the genome come from? Where did the DNA come from? How does the DNA, how does protein molecules know how to communicate to create a human being? That's that intelligence behind it all, you see. And so when you're dealing with this phenomena of physical evidence, yeah, there's a lot of it. At least enough, we don't have like truckloads and truckloads of it, but there's enough of it from around the world over time to say, yeah, this is not just psychological stuff, or I saw something in there and my eyes fooled me. No, we've captured it on video. No, we've gone to some of these spots and recorded radiation and saw imprints in the ground. And people say, well, why would the demonic do that? To announce they're here, to deceive us, to masquerade as.
Yeah, Vash, you know what's going on there with the whales beaching themselves and birds dropping out the sky, the bees dying off. That's God slowly taking our food supply. That's what's going on there.
Little green men from other planets. See, that's the perfect way. I mean, if I'm Satan and I want to get the whole world, we already know the whole world is manipulated most by fear. Fear. Now, love overcomes fear, and love only comes from the heart of God, but most of the planet does not have a heart for Jesus Christ and the Word of God and God. So they're motivated by fear. We see that in the pandemics and, you know, and the closing down of everything overnight. Fear, we're all going to die, fear. Well, Satan knows this. He's watching this. He's watching even the church's reaction to all of this right now. And so if you can imagine that, bringing something like this to the planet, and then like a criminal who's trying to mislead would leave behind DNA evidence, or would put a gun there, but it wasn't the gun used, or they would wipe the fingerprints off, or whatever. You know, they would leave physical evidence, maybe on purpose, to mislead or to misdirect the investigators. Well, if we humans can be that evil and conniving, how much more the demonic realm? How much more the demonic realm? That's where humans learn their evil from. If they're not saved, they learn it from Satan whispering in their ear and from demonic manipulation. So yeah, there is physical evidence. It has been recorded in various ways. And my explanation for it is, why would they do that? I just gave it. Because it's a deception. It's a masquerade. We're being groomed. We're being set up for that thing that Jesus spoke of. And I don't know when Jesus said this, he was talking about UFOs. But he said there's going to come a deception, guys, in the last days that could even fool the very elect if that were possible. And people will die from heart attacks when they see the terror that's coming upon the world. You know, I mean, listen to the language. So let me give an example. Whenever I talk about this, I use this example. Think of what if the Lord was going to come this week in his kingdom glory. Well, let's say a few months from now, but Satan knew it. And so he had to try to pull off his last great deception. And Satan knows his time is short, by the way. Revelation 12:12 says that. He's filled with rage, and you can see it all over the planet. He knows it's coming. So to try to hold on to it, he's got to create this global fear and panic to cause everybody to bow down to his man, to whom he's going to give supernatural powers to call fire from heaven, to deceive, images that will move and talk. I mean, it's all in the book of Revelation. What does that mean? We don't know yet, but in our minds, this is the point I'm getting to. In our modern minds, in this day and time, if the world is allowed to go on for hundreds of more years, we can't even imagine the technology that's coming. Just like 20 years ago, we couldn't imagine the technology we're using right now. Okay? So, but if it's not allowed to go on for hundreds more years, let's say this is it. This is kind of the apex of the technology. Then in our life, if Satan is going to deceive the whole world, now watch this, Josh, even the very elect, and all that word means is people like you and me. The word elect doesn't mean perfect. It just means we are believers in the Word of God. We believe in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. He's the coming King. We're filled with the Holy Spirit who leads us into all wisdom and knowledge, who takes...
Actually, all jokes aside about gay fish, the Indonesians are known for raping the waters and just killing sharks, just taking their fins for fin shark soup. And they're just destroying complete ecosystems. Our Navy chase some of their fishing vessels out of our waters over time. They come into your waters as pirates and steal all the fish, and we had to get the Navy on them.
Away fear. God has not given us this spirit of fear. He's given us the Holy Spirit. Okay, we're the elect.
Yep.
But Jesus said, but even Josh and Carl, if they're there during that time, could be deceived. If that were possible. Now, when he puts that qualifier there, here's how I interpret it.
Good, how?
It's highly possible that Josh and Carl will be deceived for just a little bit, but it's not possible for them to stay deceived because they have the spirit of truth in them.
Yeah.
But this thing that's coming is so big that people are going to die when they see it. They're going to have heart attacks. And even God's people like Josh and Carl will be protected from that. But for a minute, we might just be startled out of our pants. And then we say, wait. And the Holy Spirit says, and to us, and then we begin to say, this is what Jesus was talking about. Okay, what could that be? Now, here's my question. Here's the $1 million question. In the world we live in, brother, it's going to take a lot to fool Josh and Carl. You know, I'm not saying we're the most brilliant people in the world, but think of all the technology we already know about. I mean, holographic images, we can project in the sky. I mean, you know, all of the technology we have. What's it going to take to make Josh and Carl come right up next to a heart attack if we see it? Or to almost question our faith for a little bit if we see it? What would it take? The only thing at this point in human history that I can imagine would be something like, envision this scenario. I know this is going to sound science fiction. It sounds like a movie, but watch. What if you and I right now, we concluded this interview, both of us walked outside. You're in one part of the United States, I'm in another part. We walked outside. We looked up in the sky and it was filled with spacecraft that were like 4 and 5 football field lengths. I mean, thousands, tens of thousands of them.
Yeah, vast. Mike from around the world said the volcanoes are heating up the oceans and that. And that's why we're getting all these floods around the world and massive rain, because there's floods all over the planet. We know that, guys. And that's because Mike from around the world says that the oceans are heating up, and Vast just referenced that as well. So things aren't going to get better.
Bring over the earth. People would be screaming. I mean, sirens going off. All militaries of the world would be called to action. I mean, can you imagine? There would be people dying of heart attacks. Nobody would stop and say, oh, that's a hologram, but it's all over the world. You and I both would be startled. Maybe even, I'm going to go ahead and admit, I'm a pretty brave guy. I was a cop for years. I've been shot at people, but I'd be scared for a little bit. If I walked out and saw that, I'd be more than startled. But I don't think it would be long before the Holy Spirit of God would begin to minister to my heart, and I would begin to say, oh my gosh, it's here. This is it. This is the great deception. So that's just one scenario, and I'm just pulling this out of my head and out of my back pocket. But it's connected to scripture utterances from Jesus and from the Old Testament and from the New Testament about the last days. And I'm going to tell you something else I've written about that fits to this, brother. And again, it's a biblical speculation, but I went back, even some of the classic scholars saw this possibility and wrote about it with the best language they had. It's in my book, Masquerade. Remember when Jesus is asked about the last days, and in Matthew 24, he's going through this litany, and one of the things he says, let me tell you something else that's going to happen. And I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, but you put it in modern English, he said, all over the earth, there are going to be false messiahs. And there's going to be false prophets that are going to be coming, talking about these false messiahs coming. And they're going to say, look, he's out in the desert. No, they're over here. They're on the Temple Mount. No, they're over here. No, they're in the seat of power over here. He says, no. He says, when the true Messiah comes, the Son of Man, it will be like lightning from the east to the west. You won't be able to miss it. Now, I did some deep search into those words, and I've got this study in the book of Masquerade, and then I went back to some of the classical scholars, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, just to see any inkling. I actually ran across
I did.
that said, he is not talking about the false prophets and messiahs that we would think of now. He's talking about something in the last days that we cannot even yet imagine that has to do with entities. One guy said the entities masquerading, and that's why I put it in my book, because they use the word, the title of my book, masquerading as messiahs and saviors to the world. And they will first be announced by people saying that they are coming. I mean, they actually said this a couple of hundred years ago. And they didn't say UFOs or aliens. They were just talking about this. And I thought, oh my gosh. the prophecies are already going on. I mean, people write about it. The movies are prophesying it. Video games are prophesying it. You know, the zombie apocalypse and the UFO invasions. There's a new one out right now as we're speaking. I forgot, it's called the end of the time, or the last war. I think it's called the last war, something like that. That's what it's. Yeah, Tomorrow War. Yeah, it's all about, you know, this invasion of UFOs and everything, and they're prophesying. And what if that's their purpose? As these ufologists who have been studying this for decades are now saying, they want us to see them. They are preparing us for something. What do you think their message is going to be? We are your savior. We're going to keep you guys from killing each other in this nuclear war you almost started. Bow down, worship us. We are the reasons you're here in the first place. We created you, or whatever. We are your savior. You don't believe it? Let me show you some signs and wonders. Revelation says that whole system of the Antichrist and the beast system will be empowered by the dragon, who is Satan. He will give them his power. Well, what's his power? He's the prince of the power of the air. You understand? So when you tie those things together, again, I'm not dogmatic, because there's no place in the Bible that says these words. In the last days, UFOs are going to come down out of the air. They're going to land, and these people are going to get out, these human-like things, and they're going to claim to be the saviors of the world. No place says that. But when you take all that we know from science, all that we know from physical evidence, all that's happened in our lifetime, all that we know from scientific manipulation, all that we know about ubiquitous global evil, all that we know about what Jesus said, people dying, it is so terrifying. You know, people being, even God's people could be deceived if that were possible. When you take all of that and cram it together, and then you look at what the movies, I mean, listen, I'm not speaking about individuals, but Hollywood as a whole and everything that has spawned off of it, you know, different movie making projects. Back in Hitler's day, they realized propaganda, man, propaganda. We can tell people what we're going to do and get them prepared for it, so when it happens, they won't freak out so much, but yet we can still do it to them. That's what that was all about. Hollywood has seized upon that. How many times, you know, you can get on the internet and find these videos that are made about, a movie is made that says certain things, and then 30 years later, it happens to the letter. And people are freaking out. How did they know that? Yeah. Well, I think they either set it up and then did it, self-fulfilling prophecy, or it was demonic knowledge that was infused into the hearts and minds and imaginations of the creators of those films. So if that's true, then if these false messiahs being spoken of by false prophets, Jesus talked about in Matthew 24, happen to be those that manifest themselves in the last days, that come through these demonic
20 earthquakes in the 5 range. That's pretty big amount for the 5.
Wormholes and portals. The words wormhole and portal are not in the Bible, but different dimensions are. And excursions and encroachments from those dimensions, that's mentioned in the Bible. I mean, this might be what we're being set up for, which is why you're examining this.
It's amazing to think about that we could be headed towards that day now. And what's really strange is that we today are living in a day where the government is actually openly admitting to having some knowledge and even being involved in some research having to do with this UFO phenomenon. I can't even believe that we're living in that day today, but we're here.
Okay. I've just finished with this, guys. Hang on. Check this out.
Unpleasant odors in your drains? Easy off drain odor stop. Used regularly to help prevent buildup of clogs. Proven to remove 99.9% of odor causing bacteria.
Hang on, guys. Okay, I'll finish on a couple of these.
can you be Jewish and believe in Jesus? Isn't that an oxymoron? He's died for our sins. How are Jewish people atoning for their sins today? When my grandmother was a child in Nazi Germany, had to wear a Jewish star, she was sitting in the classroom and the teacher had said, "Stand up, all of you that are Jewish." So she stood like a good Jewish girl, and the teacher said to her, "Sit down. You should be proud to be Aryan." Here she is, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jewish girl, very proud of who she was as a Jewish girl, but the teacher's telling her to sit down because she had Aryan features. My grandfather was a fun, sarcastical, very smart Jewish man.
That's a big one, Diane. 7.
Who loved teaching me Yiddish. I was blessed to grow up in a Messianic Jewish home, had Hebrew lessons, and I had a bat mitzvah, and that really gave me the opportunity to share Jesus with a lot of my friends. Probably the most conversations I had were with a lot of my friends that were Orthodox, because they really knew the Torah and the Haftorah well, and it gave me the opportunity to open up scripture for those that understood scripture and be able to point to passages like Isaiah 53 and Isaiah 9. Who is this Messiah? And has he already come? Well, I think as I became older, I got more questions about being Jewish and believing in Jesus. A lot of my friends were so confused and curious as to how I could be Jewish and believe in Jesus. Like, that's an oxymoron, isn't it? Caused a lot of dialogue. Some people were just lackadaisical about it. They say, "Oh, well, you can believe what you want to believe. I'll believe what I want to believe. Everyone can believe what they want to believe." However, others, especially those that were Orthodox, really started having some major questions about it. I think the worst of it was when I was sharing the gospel and with some people, an Orthodox person had walked by and they just spit on me. Really? Here's a person that supposedly loves God, and that's what he's going to do? He's going to spit on me because I have a difference of belief and believe that Jesus is the Messiah? When you really think about it as a Jewish person, how are Jewish people atoning for their sins today? If we're man and we're sinful and we're imperfect, and now that we don't have the temple to actually go and sacrifice and atone for our sins, how are we atoning for our sins?
Good question.
Yeshua did indeed come. He's died for our sins so that we no longer have to even atone for our sins, believing that Jesus is the Messiah, that he died for our sins, and he is coming again is just so awesome. And there's no hope like that hope. All through my teenage years and my growing up, I've been able to walk alongside Yeshua. You definitely get people asking questions and it's pretty difficult. But I have to say, staying strong in that belief in Yeshua and having that joy and love and peace that comes from it, it just overflows. And my friends and people really respected that because I was able to be filled with that joy and love that Jesus, Yeshua, brings.
Okay, here's one about the Jewish Messiah. I'll finish with this one, guys.
Battery World is proud to be the place Aussies choose to power their passion. So if you're hitting the open road on your next outdoor adventure, or simply taking pride in a job well done, there's only one place to go, and that's Battery World.
Oh, these damn ads.
Between the Jews and the Muslims. We know this. The Bible tells us this. Hello, friends. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about something that is very, very important. You want to stick around for this video. Anybody who has heard of this guy, I want you to leave it in the comments below. There is a man who is causing such a stir in Israel. And let's just face it, if somebody is causing this much of a stir in Israel especially, we as Christians need to be looking at, because this is a clue to how close we are. So you want to share this video with your friends and family. You want to let them know just how close we are. And this is a huge indicator. This man's name is Yanuka Rav Shlomo Yehuda. So apparently the title Yanuka is given to someone who has an astonishing amount of knowledge and is proficient in the Torah and the Talmud. So we're going to get into that. It's almost miraculous and non-human how much this man knows. So he actually has thousands of people in a half video. Thousands of people literally swarm around him when he goes anywhere. And that includes prominent rabbis in Israel. And he's young. He's maybe in his mid-30s. They kiss his hands. They hang on every word. He's accredited to performing miracles. And I want to say even the people who claim that they had received a miracle at his hand, none of them have given any credit to God. They give the credit to this guy. So like I said, the title Yanuka is given to somebody who is extremely well versed in both the Torah, which is the Old Testament, and the Talmud, which is the oral traditions handed down through generations by the Jews, and they started writing them. I want to say it was in the 1300s. I'm not sure about that, but he's also very proficient in music. So was the devil, just saying. But yeah, he's extremely, this isn't even humanly possible for somebody to have memorized all of that by the age of 15. He has prominent rabbis following him. You can see people just mobbed around him and kissing his hands and proclaiming miracles from this man. It's just crazy. I've never seen anybody followed like this in Israel. So this is significant. You can see them crowded around. All of these people here are there to see him. They're there to see him. I think this is at a tomb of Rachel, maybe, and he's praying at the tomb of Rachel. But all of these people are mobbed around him. And this is very reminiscent of how the people followed Jesus. And that's...
I wonder if Netanyahu's met this guy yet. I bet he has.
Prominent rabbis kissing his hands and seeking him out for advice and to say prayers and supplications. And, it's just astonishing that a person could receive this sort of accolation from prominent rabbis in Israel. We know that they're waiting on the Messiah still. This man is likely going to be who they're going to name the Messiah, because nobody else has came in history besides Jesus who was so proficient in the Torah and now their Talmud as well. Okay, and keep in mind, we do know that they do have 5 red heifers over there now in Israel, and they are getting ready for the sacrifices in the temple. They're getting ready for everything is lining up exactly how the Bible tells us. And for all of these high up rabbis to be kissing his hands, it's crazy. Okay, so you've seen the video. You've seen how people are just literally flocking. And that is so reminiscent of Jesus. When Jesus was here, all of these people flocked around him, just even if they could just reach through the crowd and touch the hem of his garment. People flocked around him. Thousands followed him to hear him speak. That's what's happening with this guy. Okay. So the thing is, if they proclaim this man to be the Messiah, the long-awaited Messiah that the Jews have been waiting for, because we know that the Jews don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. This has been a long, outstanding question among Christians. How could somebody come along that the Jews would accept and the Muslims would accept? Because if he's Jewish, why would the Muslims accept him? And if he's Muslim, how could the Jews accept him? Somehow there's going to be peace between the Jews and the Muslims. We know this. The Bible tells us this. But how? This has been a question for so long.
Okay, how the Abrahamic Accord. The Pope's built Abrahamic Accord. He's built 3 buildings in the one acreage. One's for Muslims, one's for Jews, and one's for Christians. So that's how he's going to do it.
The Muslims believe, and it's written in their Quran, that Jesus, they don't believe Jesus was the Son of God, but they do believe he was a prophet. And in their Quran, they say when their Mahdi, their Messiah, when their Mahdi comes, he will come with Jesus. And Jesus will be like a minister to him and like a prophet, a false prophet.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing. That's the thing right there. If this man is going to be proclaimed to be the Messiah and proclaimed to be Jesus, the only way the Muslims would accept him is if he proclaimed their Mahdi.
Wow.
And worked with him, like their Quran says he will. This might be something very significant. Yeah, I want to know your thoughts on this because I haven't heard a lot of people talking about this. I feel like if this really is significant, there will be a lot more talk about it. A lot of people are going to start talking about this guy. And yeah, it's going to be significant. If it's anything. I mean, you know, the Bible says that there'll be lots of false prophets, lots of false messiahs who come and say, I am the Messiah. So it might be just something like that. But it could be something we don't know. Because this guy is so proficient. It's not even humanly possible, everything that he accomplished by the age of 15. So I do think this is significant. This is a significant person that we should be keeping an eye on. So I hope this video enlightens you. Please make sure and like it. If you like these type of videos, please make sure and like it. It helps the algorithms for my YouTube channel. It helps more people be able to see the video. And the more likes the video gets, the more YouTube will suggest the video to other viewers. So that's why it's so important for you to hit that like button. And yeah, share it with your friends and family because they need to know how close the time is.
Mm-hmm.
This is significant. And honestly, it makes me feel very excited that the rapture is close. Because we already know who the Messiah is. It is Jesus, our Savior, and he's coming back for his church. If all of this stuff is getting ready to break out, that just tells us how close the rapture really is.
Amen.
So, anyway, I hope you're all having a great day, and I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye for now.
Okay, guys, I'll do a couple of more testimonies from Jews turning to Christ. Look at that one. There's that laser. Check this out.
Description box below. Find us over on Rumble or go to saltmostmo.com. Hit that watch live button.
Actually, no, I don't even want to show that. Oh, man, I can't get that image out of my head now.
Up with any sense of identity. Here's it. We're Jews. They're Christians. And they blame us for killing their God, Jesus Christ. When my grandfather died, I was 6 or 7 years old, and it was a very hush-hush thing. Nobody wanted to talk about it. What happens after you die? We weren't even allowed to go to the funeral And I remember asking my teacher in synagogue, what happens after we die? And she didn't really know. She said, go see the rabbi. So I met with the rabbi. And I remember him telling me the story about a man climbing up a mountain, and he's only seeing the trees. And he's journeying up the mountain and never sees what's over the other side because he's climbing the mountain. But God, who is at the top of the mountain, sees over the other side of the mountain. And that was my rabbi's answer. The rabbi had no more idea
What's that even
than I
mean?
did what happens after you die. He didn't know. I went on to university, and those two driving issues remained in my mind. Why am I here? I'm here for a purpose, and what's going to happen to me after I die?
Yeah.
I got involved in drugs and rock and roll. I started to go to Grateful Dead concerts and doing drugs, and that was, I guess, sort of a hobby for me. But there was something spiritual about that experience, the drugs and the music. And I knew very clearly from my drug experiences that there's more to this life than just what we see. There's a world beyond this world. So through college, I'm exploring. I'm involved in these cults and the occult, and I'm searching for God. A friend of mine had really gotten heavily involved in drugs, and I saw her lose interest in classes. She stopped attending classes. She disappeared from my life. She really looked like she was dying from using drugs. She was suicidal. She was considering taking her life until one day I was walking on campus and I bumped into her, and her name was Susie. I said, Susie, what happened to you? Because she was smiling, she was vibrant, she looked terrific. And she began to tell me that something profound happened. She had wandered into a pool hall, and the owner of the hall had just become a Christian. And he witnessed her and he told her about Jesus, and she had prayed with him to accept Jesus. And now she was born again. Her life had completely been transformed. And I said to her, I'm really happy for you, Susie. That's great. It's not for me, but if it makes you happy, that's great. And then she invited me to a Bible study. And I wanted to say no, but somehow out of my mouth, I said yes. And it was pouring rain, and I had a motorcycle. And I thought, I have a good excuse not to go to this Bible study. But I remember getting on the back of the motorcycle and driving through the pouring rain to this Bible study that I didn't want to go to. And I remember walking into the study, I was soaking wet, my clothes were soaked. But from the time that the Bible study started, and I don't remember what was taught, it was the book of Revelation and how the world's coming to an end. But I just thought, I want to get out of here. But I couldn't because my clothes were in the dryer. So I was a captive audience. And at the end of the Bible study, the teacher invited me to go upstairs and talk with him. He gave me a Bible, and he began to take me through these scriptures in my own Jewish Bible to begin with, and then in the New Testament about sin and separation from God. I had never read the Bible before other than preparation for my bar mitzvah. We Jews are supposed to be the people of the book, but most Jewish people have never even read the scriptures that we claim to be our own. And as he showed me verses about my sin and separation from God, like all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Our righteousness is as filthy rags. I just felt the weight of my sin. I was hot. The room was bright. I felt the presence of what I knew to be God himself. And so I prayed this prayer with him, and as soon as I prayed, the room went back to normal temperature. The lights went back to normal. The sofa that felt like it was holding me in place released me. The Bible shrunk back to a normal size. My clothes were presented to me dry. I changed and I raced home and tried to forget this experience. But something changed in my heart that night. And I had a desire for the first time to read the Bible. I had never read the Bible before. I claimed to believe the Bible, but I didn't really know what the Bible said other than the stories that I had learned growing up. And I just devoured the Bible. And I began with the book of Matthew. I had never read the New Testament. I was taught that the New Testament was the Christian Bible. The only connection that it had with my heritage as a Jew was that it was anti-Semitic. And much of Judaism, as we wandered through Europe and other nations, was an effort to survive in what became a Christian world. Christianity was defined by its hatred of the Jewish people and blaming the Jewish people for almost 2,000 years now. So for a Jew to consider Jesus, there's really a terrible history to overcome. But I really felt this pull to read the New Testament. And I began in Matthew chapter 1. Right in the beginning, it listed the genealogy of Jesus. Jesus, the son of Abraham, the son of David. And that just jumped out at me. And I immediately it was shocking. What is Abraham and David, two of the greatest men in our history, doing in the Christian Bible? I discovered things that were completely different than I had been taught growing up. I discovered that Jesus was Jewish, that he had a given name, a Hebrew name, Yeshua, which means salvation, because he will save his people from their sins. I discovered that he was born in Israel of Jewish parents. I thought he grew up in Rome, in the Vatican. All of the first followers of Yeshua were all Jews, and none of them converted to another religion. They didn't convert to Christianity. There was no Christianity. No, they were Jewish men and women who had found their promised Messiah from their own scriptures, the Tanakh. And that changed my life. I began to find the answers that I had been looking for in my own scriptures, in the Tanakh. I discovered that God had a purpose for my life, and that purpose was to know him, to walk with him, to serve him. I discovered that there is a life after this life. I knew almost immediately that God was calling me, that he had a destiny for my life to serve him full time. I ended up moving to Russia after leading a Messianic congregation from a number of years in upstate New York, and then began to work in Ethiopia, in Zimbabwe, throughout Africa. And for the last number of years, we've been providing medical clinics where we provide dental care, eye care, medicines, even surgeries, free of charge. We just do it to serve and to let people know that God loves them. And my brother was a photographer. That's one of the things.
Okay, guys, see you tomorrow. God bless. Gary Wayne was a very interesting interview. Yes.